Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Savior King, the Master Tactician and the Queen of Liberation in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 46. The leaders of the church have misused its creed to fulfill their true desire, to rule the world. They have fooled the people of Fodlan. Long ago, they divided the empire to make a kingdom, and then, divided that kingdom to create an alliance. They did all of this to make the masses bicker among themselves. They created instability to reinforce their own authority. Those corrupt hypocrites cannot lead Fodlan to true peace. Their foul belief system must be torn asunder so that true wisdom may finally prevail. So I have decided by order of the Adrestian Emperor, Edelgard von Hresvelg, the Empire hereby declares war on the Church of Syrios and their allies. What a complete farce. Atra spat the words out like they were poison in her mouth, glaring at the multi-page manifesto on the table with such ferocity it was amazing half the room didn't spontaneously catch fire. She has the gall to speak of wisdom when she's funding Agartha out of her own coffers. The black-haired girl raged. As if she isn't a corrupt hypocrite herself for giving those remorseless murderers her protection in order to violently conquer Fodlan with this as a pretext. Hey, deep breaths, Atra. Hilda cautioned, grabbing the girl's hand. There's no point in losing your head in here, there's no one to take it out on. Yeah. Take it easy, Morning Dove. Happy said seriously. The red-haired girl kicked her feet in the air where she was sitting on the table. You're going to wear a tunnel straight through the floor at the rate you're pacing. Atra blew out a long breath and raked a hand through her hair, trying to take their advice. Hilda tugged her toward a chair next to Glenn and Ingrid, the former scowling darkly while the latter was visibly pale and worried. She isn't wrong, Lysathea said bitterly. We're waiting for the opening of a continent-wide war that is nothing but a complete waste of lives and resources that will do nothing but make our real, mutual enemy more powerful. What the hell is she thinking? She thinks she's going to save everyone, Dorothea said weakly, leaning on Sylvain's shoulder. She sounded so defeated, like she was praying this was just a dream. The playboy looked unusually awkward, patting her on the shoulder and partially hiding her when all the eyes in the room fell on her. That's what she said when she was talking to us in the classroom. She wants to get rid of the nobles, devalue crests, make it possible for everyone to live a good life. By empowering Thales. Atra nearly shrieked, Hilda grabbing her shoulder allowing her to catch herself at the last moment. Is she completely mad? I heard her talking to Caspar once, about his being removed from inheritance from lacking a crest, Linhard murmured lowly. He glanced to his right, as if hoping to see his close friend walk through the front door and tell him that this was all some magnificent misunderstanding. He bawled her out for assuming how he felt about the matter, and said, Your problem is that you think that everything is about you, . He bit his lip. I wonder if Edelgard thinks that she's the only person who can make Fodlan better. Sylvain looked away at the mention of the crestless lacking inheritance. Ingrid bit her lip and looked down at her hands, clearly imagining the crest that a greedy merchant had been willing to kidnap her over. Mercedes simply closed her eyes while Marianne pressed a hand against her chest, like she was listening for a beast growling inside her chest. By involving Thales and Agartha, Atra repeated for the third time, loathing and scorn mixing in her voice. Profiting off every evil he inflicts on her own people. She clearly believed that this choice the Emperor had made invalidated any reason she might have had for it. Dmitri didn't look up from his hands. Frankly, Atra was speaking for him for the most part, and he was fairly certain that if he let his attention slip away from Bernadetta's fingers pressing against his, he would vanish inside himself again, and possibly be unable to emerge. He could feel another scream sitting in his throat, waiting to be unleashed, fury and grief and hatred, the voices of the dead who had been sacrificed in the name of salvation while he had survived. He could feel Claude's worried eyes on him, and Marianne's gentle sympathy, too. Knowing they were there, feeling Bernadetta's presence close to him, drowned out some of the noise in his ears and helped him ignore the ghosts crowding around him, screaming for his attention. Traitor! Kinslayer! This cannot be forgiven. Avenge us! Destroy that vile woman and her dreams of conquest. Pay our suffering back to her in kind. You must. Now. Never forgiven, no, she cannot be forgiven. Unforgivable. I don't understand that, Annette said in sweet, helpless bewilderment. Dmitri felt Bernadetta's hand tighten over his fingers and did his best to focus on his friend's soft voice and words. I mean, how did she even find out about them, much less approach them for an alliance? And why would Thales have agreed to it? Why? Glenn snorted. If the three kingdoms slaughter each other, that makes his eventual goal much easier to achieve, doesn't it? The Emperor clearly believes that she has control over their alliance, probably that once she has control of Fodlan, she can dispose of them once she no longer has need of them. She certainly has a high opinion of her own cleverness. She has to die. His father screamed in his ear. Dmitri winced, and glanced over at Bernadetta. She was shivering, fear for the future plain in her eyes, but when she saw him, she smiled at him and squeezed his hand. You're home. Don't disappear. Don't go where we can't reach you. Maybe it has something to do with the insurrection of the Seven. Mercedes offered uncertainly. That was a time of great confusion and upheaval in the empire. If anything strange could have happened behind the scenes involving Agartha, it would have happened them. It's possible, Atra said with an aggressive shrug. But does it matter at this point? No one had an answer to that. Felix snorted. Bernadetta got the right of Edelgard in the tomb. There's no point in debating what she thinks she's doing by starting this war. Now there's nothing to do but strategize. I think Felix is right, Byleth said, dropping the manifesto she had been rereading yet again, as if searching for some sort of catch between the lines. You were right about the Empire's plans, Claude. So, what do you think of our chances of holding out against the might of her army until our friends and family come to bail us out? Yuri asked with a dry grimness. He was leaning against a pillar in the Golden Deer classroom, expression dark as thunder as Byleth read the manifesto out loud to the combined classes. It's hard to tell, Claude admitted, crossing his arms. His serious eyes flicked up to the ceiling in contemplation. The Empire's marching fast. If our families push it, we might only have to hold out for a day. If we're unlucky. He shrugged helplessly. There are too many unknowns. The Empire has the largest standing army in Fodlan, due to its size. Marianne noted quietly. And that doesn't account for whatever horrors Thales provides Edelgard with in the name of raising Gareg Mach. To destroy the monastery would be to inflict a terrible blow against the hearts and minds of all those who worship Suthis. What went unsaid was that it would also affect Ria's influence over Fodlan, to an extent, anyway. Those who loved the Archbishop and saw her as Suthi's voice in the mortal realm wouldn't cease spitting on Edelgard until their throats were cut, which was a lot of people, since the vast majority of those who lived in Fodlan were of the faithful. Edelgard seemed confident that she could counteract that, however. Dmitri shuddered to think of how she planned to do so. Are you worried that reinforcements from the kingdom and alliance won't be enough to push back the empire? Ash asked her in concern. It depends on how many families send forces, and how many make it in time, Yuri pointed out with a hint of warning. I trust and expect the kingdom to make it, but the alliance, I wouldn't be surprised if there were conflicting opinions on going to war. Going to war is going to be a hard sell, Claude agreed with a shrug. However, sending men-at-arms to save the lives of their heirs? Count on it. Lawrence, Lysithea, Marianne, and Hilda being here ensures that at least 5 of the great families are going to send help. It's either that, or face the death or capture of family. That's good to know, at least, Happy muttered. A handful of the people in Abyss can fight, but mostly we have families and children and people too old or sick to hold a sword, much less swing it. War is only going to hurt them more. The monastery has many defenses we aren't considering, Byleth spoke up, a thoughtful look on her face. Do you remember those enchanted golems that attacked us in the valley, Claude? Those who had searched for the chalice all perked up at the question. Lady Rhea says that there are many we can activate to fight at our side. Ha! Balthus laughed, clapping his hands together. So someone else will be having nightmares about those fucking dolls? That's vindication, that's what that is. That earned a wave of tired chuckles from the others, and the heavy atmosphere in the room softened a bit. Dmitri looked up from his hands, flickering white figures at the corners of his vision. Byleth was looking at him through her transfigured eyes, tired yet still warm when they settled on him. He wanted to smile, but couldn't. Lady Rhea and Seath are still discussing optimal defensive plans with the knights, Byleth said, giving her head a slight shake. According to Shamir, we have 2 weeks before the Empire's army arrives. The room rumbled uneasily. Professor. Bernadetta piped up then, tilting her head. Can I ask you something? Absolutely. What happened when you sat on the throne? You kind of look like Suthies now. Did she bless you again? Dorothea, and everyone else who'd been left in the dark about the goddess's whereabouts, all gaped at the purple-haired girl, causing her to shrink into Dimitri's side. He patted her arm absently, forcing himself to focus on Byleth. It's finally time, we'll finally be free, it will all be put to rest. It's a little hard to explain. Byleth raised a hand and placed it on her chest. When I sat on the throne, I could feel an echo of something I can only describe as Suthies' previous mortal life. Once we were there, Suthies was able to recall something from before she lost her memories. She started to say something, likely to tell them what she had told him, before frowning and cutting herself off. Likely, she, quite reasonably, decided it would be bad for their current morale. Agartha, more than anything, wants to wipe out any trace of Suthies' presence on the earth. I'll explain in detail at a less frantic moment. What we discovered after she regained that memory was that, somehow, her heart was inside of me. Her heart. Linhard repeated slowly. He walked over to her and put a hand on her chest, seemingly oblivious to Dorothea's chastisement and the various glowers this earned him. Dimitri nearly launched himself at the green-haired priest. Claude glared at the back of his head. How is that possible? Byleth gave him a bemused look and pointedly grasped his wrist, pulling it aside. I don't know. I must have received it when I was a child. Suthies thinks it may be the reason I had no emotions growing up. They were all repressed due to how weakened her heart was. Linhard mumbled an apology. She ruffled his hair fondly before dropping her hand to the sword of the Creator and drawing it. The glowing light in the hilt hadn't dimmed much since the conflict. It didn't quite hurt to look at it, but it was bright and felt warm, even from several feet away where Dimitri was sitting. His ghosts hovered in a circle around him, many of their heads bowed in reverence. Suthies gave her heart to me, now it does more than sustain me, it's fully merged into my body. That means I have access to far more of her magic, along with the true power of the sword of the Creator. She pointed the blade up toward the ceiling, a little crooked smile on her face. Those new demonic beasts are nothing to me, and my capacity to use divine pulse without keeling over has dramatically increased as well. I'm still human, or at least, I'm still mortal, but I've been enlightened. She smiled faintly. I know a lot more magic now, as well. It just popped into my head when I woke up. Is Suthies still with you? Marianne asked. Dorothea made a noise somewhere between confusion, disbelief and pure shock. Byleth smiled apologetically at her. Yes, she is. Her lip quirked and she raised a hand as if to wave. Dimitri could just see Suthies' playful smirk in her eyes. She says hello and not to worry. We'll protect you. Does this make you the new king of liberation? Claude asked. His tone was playful and jesting, but there was an undercurrent of thought to his words. The timing is quite something, if it's true. Byleth didn't look jubilant at the thought, but it made Dimitri smile. It fits you, he told her quietly. She returned the gesture hesitantly. There you are. Marianne's voice drew Dimitri out of his brooding. He looked away from the fields spread out beyond the walls of the monastery. He had been standing on the highest floor of Gareg Mach, watching the horizon as the sun set. In the days since the attack on the Holy Tomb, he'd been restless and agitated, spending more time in a drugged sleep than he did awake. Manuela had warned him not to overdose and strictly monitored his intake, likely for the best, as this was the closest he'd gotten to a comfort from his nightmares and pains. He wasn't sure he trusted himself to be careful enough to remember that medicine in one dose was poison in another. Marianne, he acknowledged, watching her step up to the wall next to him. Can I help you? I came to ask you that, she responded without judgment. You've avoided Claude and the professor for a few days. That's very unlike you. Ah. Dimitri sighed. It's true. I'm afraid I made them a promise that I can't keep. Because of what happened in the Holy Tomb. Part of him wanted to snap at her, but his tongue stilled when he saw the look in her eyes. She, of all people, knew what it was like to become a monster. He bit his lip and sighed. Yes. Turning out toward the setting sun, he mused at how that, for a brief time, it looked like the sky was bleeding. Ever since that day at Dusker, I've discarded my humanity whenever I stepped onto the battlefield. My vision fills with a red haze. Sometimes I feel as if my spirit disconnects from my body, allowing me to watch myself as though I were a stranger as I crush all opponents who come across me. He looked forlornly at his hands. It's monstrous. Mary Ann guessed. She put a hand on his wrist, looking out at the sky with him. I understand, but Dmitri, isn't everything that happens on a battlefield monstrous one way or another? Dmitri started to respond, but stopped. Even in the relative quiet he was enjoying, he couldn't find a response to the question. You're a very empathetic person, Dmitri. I think that's why this other side of you came into existence. You tend to take other people's pain as your own. Mary Ann gave him a look. Don't carry my grief as well as your own, Your Highness. That's too much a burden for anyone. If I don't, who will? Everyone, she said quietly. The professor said to me that sharing our burdens is the only way we can live when troubled times pass us by. Dmitri nodded hesitantly. After a moment of comfortable silence, he quietly asked her, will you be all right? To go to war, with the trouble your crest gives you. Mary Ann closed her eyes for a moment. I am worried, but I have faith, in everyone, and in Suthies. They won't let me end up like Maurice. That could mean one of two things. Dmitri chose not to ask her which she meant. He would simply look out for her when the time came, like she was doing for him now. Thank you, Mary Ann. You're welcome. They remained there, watching the sunset, for a few minutes afterwards until a familiar voice called out to the blue-haired girl. Blinking, Dmitri glanced over his shoulder to see Ash trotting down the road toward them. The prince felt himself smile, waving at his fellow classmate and took a step backward. I'll see you tomorrow, he excused himself politely. Mary Ann blinked and started to nod before she noticed Ash. Then she started a bit, and brightened at the sight of him. Grinning, Dmitri walked off and disappeared around a corner. A sudden streak of rather Claude-esque mischievousness, it was his fault, obviously. He leaned against the wall and listened in. Mary Ann, I found you. Stones scraped against the ground from Ash shuffling his feet. I wanted to see how you were doing. Thank you. I'm glad to see you're still smiling, Ash. Oh, right, honestly, I probably wouldn't be if it weren't for Claude. Mary Ann made a questioning noise. There was a note of fondness in Ash's voice as he explained. I asked him how he could smile even when he's going into battle, and what he told me, it's about supporting your friends and convincing them everything will be okay. He chuckled. I've been practicing for a while, and I think it actually makes me feel a little braver, too. I know what you mean. Claude is, sort of like the wind. He keeps us up in the air, no matter what happens. There was a lightness in her voice as she asked, does he know you consider him a good friend? You might have to tell him to his face, he doesn't really assume very much. I'll have to remember that. There was a pause. Dmitri was a little embarrassed by his eavesdropping, and might have left if Ash hadn't spoken up again. Hey, Mary Ann. Yes. I just wanted to, hang on. He mumbled something the prince couldn't hear before clearing his throat. I just wanted to get something off my chest before what happens. Ash. You're very important to me. Ash blurted out. And I hope that, when there's peace again, that you'd be willing to come and visit the Gaspard dukedom with me. If you would like that. Dmitri buried his face in his hands to smother either a laugh, a sympathetic wince, or a knowing noise that he also would have blamed entirely on Claude and his corrupting influence. He could imagine how stunned the self-deprecating Mary Ann was right now. Ash, meanwhile, wasn't sure what to make of her reaction. I really like you. You're very kind, and wise, and I feel like I'm learning more about the world every time you talk to me. You've had to deal with something really terrible hanging over your head for a long time, but you've never used that as an excuse to be anything less than an amazing person, and that's really amazing. I admire you more than ever now, really. I've seen how you take care of the horses, and the cats, and that endless kindness you have for everyone is really amazing and something I wish I could match. I mean, You don't have to do anything. You don't have to promise anything, I hope, dash. Ash's frantic babbling broke off in a squeak, and a moment of silence. Dmitri didn't dare peek around the corner lest he give himself away, but he did press himself against the stone in anticipation. Ash, Marianne murmured after a moment, her voice tender and shaky. I've decided something. Why you have? Yes. I'm going to live. Huh. No matter what the Empire or Agartha throw at me in days to come, or how my crest might try to change me, I'm going to live. Then we'll go to Faerghus together. Really? There was a shuffle, and Dmitri suspected Marianne had just hugged the silver-haired archer. Why yes. Living is good. Living is amazing. Thank you, Marianne. At this point, Dmitri's manners finally reasserted themselves. He scrambled down the walkway and back into the monastery, nearly slamming the door shut behind him before managing to catch himself. He was smiling widely now, and possibly blushing. Goodness, have I switched heads with Hilda? Byleth will be delighted to know about this, but it's none of my business to tell her. She'll have to hear about it through Marianne or Ash, or both. Living is good, huh? Dmitri closed his eyes, slowing and coming to a stop. It was like getting hit by lightning. He felt like the biggest fool alive, and he shook his head in self-recrimination. Goddess, I owe them an apology. I am the most foolish prince who ever lived. His sense of purpose renewed, Dmitri headed off in the direction of the stairs. The halls were distractingly empty. The clerics and staff who were always around with a friendly word and a smile were nowhere to be seen, either planning evacuation routes or collecting weapons for repairs at the blacksmith. It was eerie, how quiet this made the ancient monastery. It felt intrinsically wrong. This was the heart of Fodlan, a place of happiness. Now it was a fortress preparing for a siege. And here I was, planning to wallow in self-hatred and doubt in those days leading up to a battle that could well be my last. Thank heavens for you, Ash. He found the stairwell fairly quickly, and was about halfway down before he registered some loud voices caught up in an argument. Not a little girl anymore, Balti. I'm not going to go hide in the tunnels while Teach and everyone else fight for their lives. Hilda's protest snapped him out of his tunnel vision. Dmitri stalled by an arrow slit, standing awkwardly in place when he realized that his only way down was blocked off. He could see the pink head below shiver, likely as a result of the girl stomping her feet. I wasn't saying anything like that. Balthus protested. I just want to know you're going to get out of this fight, so at least promise me you'll retreat if things get hairy. That's not fair. You know I can't do that. If someone needs my help, I have to go back for them. Hilda thrust her hands out to the side. And I also know that you won't retreat without a direct order from the professor. I remember that time with the demonic beast way back when, even if you don't. Of course I remember, Balthus huffed out a sigh. Geez, since when did the lazy girl want that much responsibility? Since she found a lot of people she needed to protect. Don't expect this sort of attitude towards everything, Hilda sniffed. Look, Hilda, I know how tough you are. I just gotta know you're going to get to the other side of this, right? He laughed. This is what you do to me, turning the king of grappling into a worried, nervous mess with the strength to punch through a demonic beast and the eye to make sure I don't miss. I can't let anything bad happen to you. Because Holst would kill you. It sounded like Hilda was trying to tease him, but her breath hitched a bit and her head turned, like she was looking away. No, because I wouldn't forgive me. Balthus corrected in all seriousness. That made Hilda start, if Dmitri read her reaction right. The older man reached out and patted her on the top of her head. I'm gonna have your back every step of the way, so you watch mine, alright? Hee, alright. That I can promise. Hilda then took a few steps forward, likely to get a hug, which she was promptly granted. Dmitri leaned against the rail, staring at the ceiling and rather hoping they would walk past without noticing him. Gah, not even on purpose this time. So, you were looking for the prince, right? Balthus said after a minute. Oh yeah. He's been hiding out somewhere, he's probably overwhelmed. He really liked Edelgard, you know? I mean, I think he at least considered her a friend. He was always sweet and friendly with her, even when she was sniping at him. You think he liked her that way? Despite all of Claude's initial teasing, no. I never really got that sense. But I do think he's hurting, and he's hiding because he thinks he has to be the perfect prince after freaking out in the tomb. He heard Hilda knock her fists together. So I'm going to find him and shake him until he remembers that he's a human who's allowed to screw up. She's been worried for? Ah, I truly am a fool. Ingrid is a saint for putting up with me along with Sylvain and Felix. Dimitri made his way down the rest of the stairs and remarked, I would think that most people would not encourage royalty to make mistakes. Hilda and Balthus started, and jumped about a foot away from each other when they both turned to face him. Oh, there you are. The Pinkette exclaimed, always quick to recover. I've been looking all over for you. She promptly made good on her threat by seizing him and dragging him down the hallway. Dimitri did his best not to glower at Balthus, who was trailing along behind and smirking the whole time. Mistakes are inevitable. Trying to be perfect is overrated, Dimitri, so I've made the executive decision that you need to relax and smile for a bit. Do I get any say in this? He asked half-jokingly. He was pretty sure he would have been nailed to the wall by the resulting indigent look she gave him. Since you clearly don't know how to take care of yourself, no. She retorted. Come on. We're going to find Claude. Sylvain is distracted trying to get Dorothea in a better mood by having her sing opera songs at him. Who knew? He could be sensitive when he wants to. He didn't flirt with her or anything, so that leaves my best friend. Dimitri's stomach did a little backflip, and he smiled ruefully. Might as well face it head on. I appreciate your concern, he responded honestly. Hilda looked pleased and continued to yank him along. He would have to put all his enhanced strength into any escape attempts. Frankly, that wasn't worth it. Especially since she had Balthus to act as backup if he displeased her. They made their way down to the first floor, walking past Ignatz and Flayn who were deep in conversation. The former was holding the latter's hand in a clear gesture of comfort and support. As they were walking by, Flayn bounced on her heels and threw her arms around his neck, causing him to blush redder than a tomato. Hilda cheered him on, causing both of them to jump and blush frantically, while she sauntered past without shame. Dimitri could only mouth out apologies as he was dragged past. Finding himself pulled through the front hall and out toward the fishing dock, a frequent meet-up place of theirs. Dimitri turned the corner and found himself looking out at the dock where Claude was sitting, watching the sun go down. Hello there. Hilda called as she pulled him onward relentlessly, blithely ignoring his knee-jerk attempt to dig his heels in, once they were close enough to see each other. Claude's head snapped up at her voice. Maybe it was a trick of the light, but Dimitri thought his prince's eyes lit up at the sight of him before he lazily stood up. Hey there, Hilda. Is there a dramatic need for this kidnapping? He asked cheerily. Yup. Hilda popped the pea with a smirk before all but shoving Dimitri at him. The prince nearly tripped over his own feet before stumbling to a halt. He straightened and gave her an indigent look she was completely immune to. He's sad, you make him smile. Try to cheer him up before he drives himself even more crazy, okay? She waved. I know you can do it. And then she just left. She's like a hurricane, Dimitri said in bemusement, once he caught his breath. I'd say she's more of a strong breeze, Claude disputed, gazing intensely at him. Hurricanes are consistently intense. True. Dimitri said hesitantly. He glanced over Claude's shoulder, then winced, chiding himself. Fool. Do you want to live? He licked his lips and forced himself to raise his head, look into those emerald green eyes. Claude, He wasn't given a chance to finish. Claude lunged forward and embraced him tightly, pressing his forehead into his shoulder. Dimitri gasped and stumbled back a step, feeling the brunette's heart racing against his chest, wrapping his arms around the small of his back. Claude, he whispered, drinking in his forest greenery scent. I am not afraid of you, Claude said in his ears. Do you hear me, Mitya? I am not afraid of you. A hard lump formed in the prince's throat. I'm afraid for you. Do you understand? The hidden prince let out a shuddering breath, his grip slowly tightening. Yes. I'm sorry, I can't lose you. The worst burst out Claude's throat, nearly a shout that caused Dmitri to jerk backwards in shock. But what was even worse, what felt like a knife cutting into his heart, was Claude looking at him and seeing tears at the corners of his eyes. "I can't lose you," he repeated desperately, a tear sliding down his cheek. "You can't dangle all of this in front of me, love, real love, happiness, a whole life together, and then rip it away. I thought I'd never have it, thought I would have to live without it, and then I met you and by an I love you, I need you in my life." Claude choked and swallowed hard, squeezing his eyes shut. It was like trying to suppress his emotions was causing him physical agony. "I can't lose you, Mitya, I'd rather die." Dmitri tried to respond, but the lump in his throat obstructed him. His own eyes grew blurry when Claude hit his forehead against his chest, pressing against him as if trying to hide in his arms. "Please don't leave me," the brunette begged quietly. Forcibly clearing his throat, Dmitri tangled his fingers in those soft brown curls, tugging Claude's head up and kissing him hard on the lips. Once again, his ghosts all fled like mist dissolving under the sun. His head was clear and love and warmth rushed up through his chest. "You won't lose me, Khalid," he promised when they parted after a moment, breathless. Saying his other name still felt priceless, wonderful. "I'm sorry you're in love with such a difficult fool as I. I was so ashamed of my failings I tried to hide rather than reassure you and Byleth. I promised you that I would live. I mean to keep that." Claude let out a shaky breath. He was trembling, Dmitri realized with a bolt of distress. Knowing how capable Khalid was in putting on a mask, how badly shaken was he to be displaying this much raw emotion out on the dock, away from safety? "I love you, Khalid," he whispered again for emphasis, brushing his prince's tears away before pulling him into another kiss. It took Claude lightly pawing at his shoulders for him to remember that technically, they were still out in the open. While the outside was practically empty, anyone could walk by at any moment. And yet in a flash, Dmitri realized he didn't care. Open continental war was all but on their doorstep. A group of maniacs who had once destroyed the world were lingering in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. What was the point of fighting if it wasn't for that which you loved? Instead he pulled Claude closer, tipping his head back so when he released his lips he could kiss his jaw, then begin to trail kisses down his neck. Claude let out a little mewl, an incredibly vulnerable sound coming from him, before gasping out, "Not out here. Bye's waiting." Dmitri pressed a final kiss against his collar before pulling back and nodding. Claude finally released him, brushing at his eyes and giving him that beautiful, honest little smile that tied him into knots. "Show me the way," he asked simply. Claude clasped his hand and started to lead him up a familiar passageway toward Byleth's dorm room. "You look worried, Atra." Dmitri tried to tune out Yuri's conversation with the renegade Agarthan, since it was none of his business. They really should be helping the knights prepare the siege defenses spread out in front of them, but there wasn't much room for them to help with the golems being moved into position, so they were standing back and waiting. With that damned emperor dancing of Thales's strings, bringing his newest projects to the battlefield? Whatever could I be worried about? "You're going to drive yourself insane," Yuri said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "Don't. They will do what they will do. Just try to put it from your mind as much as possible." His lip quirked. "They can't afford to destroy the world if they want to live in it, after all." Atra sighed heavily. "You never stopped trying to take care of me. I always wondered, why? Why made you decide to take me in and care about me?" For a long moment, Yuri didn't say anything. Then, after a few seconds of thought, he said, honestly, "It was because of your eyes." "My eyes? I don't understand. When I looked at you when I found you in the tunnel, I saw a girl who never gave up. When you told me what you were trying to do, I knew you were someone who would stop at nothing to set wrongs right. In all my life, I've maybe met a handful of people who have that kind of spirit, that kind of willpower. I guess I just wanted to keep you close to me." Dmitri knew without looking that Yuri was flashing her one of his mind-meltingly attractive smiles. "So maybe your courage would rub off on me." "I don't know what to say," Atra stammered, embarrassment and shock in her voice. "You don't have to say anything." Yuri looked out to the horizon again. "Just stick with me for what comes in the next few days." "A few days?" That was all the time they had before Edelgard arrived. Destroy her, his father hissed in his ear. Make her pay for all that she has done. Dmitri inclined his head. We will hold the line, he thought. Just like Pan did, so many years ago when he secured Long's victory and the creation of Faergus. We will hold the line until the cavalry arrives. Chapter 47. Claude woke up slowly to the first light of morning. Breaking the quiet was the distant sound of clanking metal. For a second, his chest tightened painfully. Thankfully, after a few moments a church horn blew, and he allowed himself to relax when it wasn't followed by all the bells ringing. Some of the knights managed to return in time, probably. Unfortunately, the shot of adrenaline noticing the sounds had given him meant going back to sleep was unlikely, at least for a while. Sighing, he carefully propped himself up on one elbow and looked down at the bed next to him. Byleth was curled up against Dimitri's side, her light green hair splayed across the pillow almost glittering in the first light of dawn. Her chest rose and fell softly in her sleep, the blankets had slipped down her bare shoulders at some point in the night. He reached over and tugged them up a bit, smiling when she shifted, murmuring in her sleep. Then his eyes slipped over to his prince, and he felt that smile fade. Dmitri was shivering despite the warmth of the room, his fingers were digging into his palms, and his lips were moving without any sound except for a small whimper. Claude was fairly adept at reading lips, and he only had to tilt Dimitri's head a little to realize the word he kept saying was father. He's having another nightmare about that day. Yeah, no, this stops now. Mitya, he whispered, placing his hand on his shoulder and giving him a firm shake. He's sweating. It must be intense. Mitya, wake up. Dmitri shuddered. After another firm shake his eyes fluttered open, blurry and unfocused, bouncing frantically around the room. Claude pinned him to the bed to keep him from jerking up, waking Byleth and possibly the rest of the hall in the bargain. With his free hand he gently cupped the blonde's face in his hand. Mitya, it's me. You're not in that place. Wake up, come back to me. Those ocean blue eyes flickered up to him and focused after a few blinks, tears flickered at the corners of his eyes. Claude, he rasped, his voice was tiny and fragile. Claude leaned down and gently kissed his forehead, then his lips. Don't even start, Claude murmured, lowering himself back onto the bed. The sheets were cool against his bare skin, which was a little surprising, maybe it was because they'd left the window slightly open. You can't help having nightmares. Especially when you've been reminded of that night recently. Dmitri didn't answer, biting his lip. Byleth, sensing a shift, rolled over and nuzzled closer to him with a sigh. That seemed to melt a little of the sadness in his expression. He reached up and stroked Claude's face, winding a strand of hair between his fingers. Claude hummed softly in response, recalling an old tune his mother used to put him to sleep with. Slowly Dmitri relaxed, the energy dying away as he ran his hands through his prince's hair. I'm so afraid. Of what? Claude asked, forcing down how startled the admission made him feel. Not necessarily that Dmitri was worried, but that he was admitting it. Usually the blonde stubbornly insisted to the bitter end that he, Byleth and the others not worry about him, that he was alright, that he'd manage despite whatever was bothering him. The Agarthans stole so many of my loved ones from me. Dmitri whispered, the tips of his fingers tracing Claude's cheek. I remember saying to Byleth after she collapsed in the tunnels that I would rather die than watch another person be killed protecting me. I don't think I articulated myself quite right. He closed his eyes in pain. I can't survive losing you or her. Maybe I would live afterwards, but all that would be left behind is an empty shell, waiting to die. Claude felt an increasingly familiar lance of pain pierce his chest. Don't say that, he whispered, an edge of pleading in his voice. Please. I could live in a world without you, he thought distantly. But I don't want to. Goddess above, I don't want to. I'm sorry. Live for yourself, too. Byleth's voice joined their hushed conversation. Dmitri tilted his head and Claude looked up to see their green-haired goddess propped up on her elbow, looking down at him with love and concern. She leaned over and kissed the side of his head, murmuring in his ear. Live for yourself and what you believe in. You have a kind and righteous heart, Dmitri, no matter what darkness clings to you. If you live for that heart, you won't lose your way. You can still say that? Dmitri asked, almost timidly. She smiled lovingly in return. I have complete faith in you. Dmitri managed a tiny smile in turn at that. He shivered when Claude kissed his shoulder, letting his hand slide down from the edge of his jaw, along the curve of neck and down his back. He had that dream again, he said by way of explanation. Byleth let out a little gasp of understanding, while Dmitri ducked his head and gave Claude a disapproving look. The brunette merely set his face in response. He only softened into a grin when Byleth turned Dmitri over and pinned him down by his shoulders, green-golden eyes serious as the dead of winter. Listen to me, Mitya. This is not Dusker. I am stronger, so much stronger than I was before. I can do things no other human can even besides divine pulse. I swear to you, on my bond with Suthies, we are going to do more than get through this, we're going to live, and we're going to win. Claude felt a shiver go down his spine, this time tinged with a strange excitement, a thrill that seeing Byleth serious always gave him. Dmitri must have felt it too, because he nodded instead of responding or falling silent. Byleth then glanced toward Claude, almost as if she could sense his lingering distress, and leaned over their golden prince to give him a kiss. It was a gesture of love and a promise and everything he needed. When the church's main bell rang, they hushed and looked at each other in alarm. It rang twice, 3 times, and then stopped after a 4th. Not the invasion. Not yet. But it was coming soon. We better get dressed, Claude noted somewhat pointlessly. They got down to the main hall and found that they weren't alone. Alois was already waiting for them there, along with Yuri and all of Geralt's mercenaries. The bell rang again after about 10 minutes, summoning the rest of the students who hadn't been woken by the first ring. Everyone, Claude noted humorlessly, was armed and alert and prepared for trouble. Though seeing as Bernadetta's hands were shaking, Ignatz kept cleaning his glasses, Flane had her arms wrapped around her stomach and her eyes closed in prayer, Dorothea shivering and openly leaning against Sylvain's side. Perhaps it was better to say that they were as mentally prepared as they could be. She'll be here today, won't she? Claude asked, simply seeking clarification. Yes, Alois answered regretfully. The last of our reinforcements arrived, just barely having survived an ambush on the road. We have about half the forces that Lady Rhea was hoping for. He raised his chin. However, we have the goddess on our side. We will prevail. Byleth twitched a bit as all her students, friends was probably more accurate, it wasn't like the school year could continue with a war going on, turned as one to stare at her. It's the truth, she assured them mildly, ignoring Alois's puzzled expression at that. Did they say anything about the army's numbers? Ah, yes, of course, about that. They think it's nearly the whole of the Empire's standing army, Hannah broke in bluntly. Rob muttered something distinctly impolite in a Dada dialect while Justine offered up a prayer to Ash on their behalf. The Emperor really wants this building gone. Can she really afford to leave her entire kingdom practically undefended? Yuri asked, one eyebrow raised in mild surprise. Well, she only has to worry about that if she fails to raise Gareg Mach, doesn't she? Hugo offered darkly. She has good reason to be confident, kiddo. Do any of you kids have any sense of when your families will send relief? If we can't survive the night, it won't matter either way, Felix noted. Bernadetta whimpered, the blue-haired knight put a hand on her shoulder, his expression was coolly intense as ever, but there was a softness to the gesture that made the purple-haired girl melt into him, and continued, but I know my old man, if he didn't raise everyone he could reach in a day before setting out the instant he got the letter, it's because he had a heart attack upon getting it. And he's not that old yet. Gramps was prepared for this. Claude commented, biting his lip. He'll have been in contact with the other lords before this emergency introduced itself. Like Felix said, we have to survive the night at least, maybe another day after that. But they'll come. They would have gotten our letters around the same time they got Edelgard's manifesto, after all. You're not worried about Gloucester and Acheron? Balthus asked, one eyebrow raised. Acheron isn't on the council, and no matter how much Gloucester hates me, Lawrence is here. Claude jerked a thumb at his contrarian classmate. Even if he sympathizes with the Empire, he can't afford to lose his only heir to this sacking. He won't obstruct rescue forces even if he doesn't send any himself, which I doubt. Does Edelgard really not realize she's effectively unified half the continent against her? Yuri wondered aloud. You're saying that like you don't think she already assumed she'd be in that position, Claude thought, his mind going back to the various times Edelgard questioned why he was friends with Dmitri. Hindsight was a cruel mistress, now it was plainly obvious that she was disturbed by the possibility of them joining forces. Which they had. She's been planning this ever since she got to the monastery, he thought darkly. Maybe even before that, depending on when she made her little alliance with Thales. All the attacks on and about the monastery that Agartha was throwing at us, she probably hoped one of them would kill me or Dmitri or both, to throw our lands into chaos. That way she could easily sweep in afterwards and reclaim the Empire's stolen lands or whatever. A thought niggled at the back of his mind, and when he pondered it for a moment, it hit him like a punch in the stomach. That bandit gang, the one that caused us to meet Teach, they didn't just happen to stumble across the three most important heirs on the continent. They were there to kill the two of us. A cold chill went down his spine. She was ready to kill us right after meeting us. No hesitation, no attempts to feel out if we might be amenable to her cause. Just death. Except I didn't stay and fight, I took off, and Dmitri chased after me, resulting in us meeting Byleth. He resisted the urge to let out a very ironic, very frazzled laugh. Who would have thought dodging previous assassination attempts would come in handy? Yuri, can Abyss start evacuating? Byleth asked. There's a good chance the Empire will employ siege weapons, and if the floor collapses in places. 'Tis already underway, Professor. Your concern is most appreciated, however. Constance said, her usual bombastic nature very subdued. We decided it would be best to move out before the attack begins, since the monastery will likely be surrounded. Did she change her mind, though? She addressed me as the Flame Emperor, said I was different, tried, most clumsily, yeah, but it was an attempt, to convince me to help her. I thought I'd thoroughly convinced her I was a lazy, underhanded fool who took nothing seriously. What made her suddenly change her mind on? Of course she did, after she saw me and Dmitri getting along. It's much easier to fight the kingdom or the alliance one at a time, instead of facing half the continent in a united front. But either she wasn't sure how to woo me, or was sufficiently intimidated by Teach's threat that she gave up trying to lure me away from her as a bad job. Have the golems been placed? How many? Claude asked aloud, partly to distract himself from his whirling thoughts. He'd been thinking himself into knots ever since the manifesto/ultimatum arrived, even though he knew it was relatively pointless by now. There are 25 that are fully combat ready, 10 of which are leading from the front. Alois said, shuddering. As unnerving as they are, I'm grateful to see them today. I don't suppose you still have that invincible one that almost killed the kids a few months back, do you? Hannah asked, partially in jest. Unfortunately I'm pretty sure it was summoned back to the valley by the magic defensive spells, Claude sighed. Then he perked up and smiled, though at least we can take solace in the knowledge that there's no way Empire soldiers could sneak into the monastery through the tunnels. That got a dry but genuine laugh out of everyone who'd been on the hunt for the chalice, even Happy. Small mercies, Ingrid said, looking a little green in the face at the reminder of what her prince and friends had gone through without her knowing. You've fought on the defensive before, right Claude? Yuri asked, stepping over to his side. He smiled wryly at his friend, he had friends, plural, and he could lose them all today, and nodded. I'm afraid my usual expertise on this matter is of limited use. I've fought street skirmishes and ambushes, but never something on this scale. This is crazy. There will be demonic beasts, Atra put in, her fingers tapping anxiously against the hilts of her swords. Something like this hasn't happened since Faerghus succeeded from the Empire hundreds of years ago, Glenn put in, his expression darkening. No one has any experience on what's about to happen. Ingrid reached over and touched his wrist, worry in her eyes. He tilted his head and gave her a faint smile in return. Catherine walked into the room then, Shamir at her heels. The room quieted as the wielder of Thunderbrand came to a stop next to Alois and focused her attention exclusively on Byleth. Claude remembered that Lady Rhea had named his star her successor in the church and suppressed what was either a grimace or a smile. If we lose Rhea in this defense, then the church's power goes to Teach, So many possibilities flickered behind his eyelids as he considered that in a split second. "Professor, are you ready?" Catherine asked. "Almost," Byleth said, glancing at the most nervous of her friends. Yuri turned and slung an arm around Bernadetta's shoulder, making her squeak in relief, and Felix scowl fiercely at him. "Well, hurry up. I don't need to tell you that the situation is dire." The blonde sword-wielding heroine swept her serious gaze over all of them. "We have some support troops from the local nobles and other branches of the church, but the army we're facing is immense. No matter how you look at it, we're at a disadvantage." Claude shrugged. "Story of my life. I'll find a way through it, I always have." Catherine smirked at him in turn. "Your eternal confidence is inspiring, Regan. You think you're capable of outsmarting Edelgard again? Count on it." Claude rolled a shoulder, glancing back at his classmates. "I'm a lot of things, but I'm not the sort of man who will just lie down and die in a place like this. And frankly, I don't think any of us are. Especially Teach." Byleth nodded briefly. "She's back already?" Hilda whistled. "Talk about impatient. Edelgard doesn't strike me as the type to trust anyone else to lead her troops competently," Yuri mused. "Or maybe she's remembering how she got stomped in the Battle of the Eagle and Lion and she's still sensitive about it." It was trash talk, obviously. Claude knew that Edelgard wasn't going to make it easy for them. However, seeing the words lift the spirits of his scared classmates, they were doing exactly what they needed them to. He saw smiles and determined looks settling over even the most nervous among them. Constance casually cracked her knuckles in a manner he'd sooner associate with Balthus. Happy took in a deep breath as if to sigh before expelling it slowly. Ingatz shifted his leather armor. Bernadetta stopped shaking and straightened up, the fear fading out of her eyes. "Everyone," Byleth started, turning around to face all of them. The mercenaries tensed up slightly, looking at her like she was a ghost. "I won't lie to you. This is going to be the hardest, the longest, and the scariest fight we've ever been in. It will be a long, hard day. It will sap at your spirit and your strength." She shook her head and gave them all a firm look, full of the determination and unbreakable spirit he so loved about her. "But I know all of you. I know what you're capable of and what you're fighting for. I wouldn't want anyone else standing behind me when I go to war. We will defend the monastery. We will repel Edelgard and her allies. And aside from making those people look like the idiots they are in the process, we're going to burn this wave of imperialism to a stop, and cast it down into the abyss of history where it fucking belongs. Now who's with me?" Everyone in the room roared back at full volume. Claude could hear Atra's voice among all of them, almost hoarse with savage delight and promise as she, like them, silently promised her eternal love and loyalty to the woman standing in front of them. Catherine was cheering as well, never mind the fact that she had seniority over the younger girl. Alois pumped his fist and looked incredibly determined in a way that wasn't goofy at all. Byleth glanced to and fro, a shaky smile on her face. He could see fear for them lingering behind the determination in her eyes. "You're not alone, Teach. I'll be nearby. Everyone who's fighting mounted, go and prepare them with some exercise. Everyone else, arm yourselves and move out to the front of the monastery. They'll join us when they're ready." She had the voice of a queen as she gave out these orders. "And remember that no matter what happens tonight, I am so damned proud of all of you." That earned her another round of cheers before they dispersed. Knowing he had to prepare ivory, Claude turned on the spot and clasped Dimitri's hand. His prince looked up and met his gaze. There was a storm in his eyes, a blaze that wasn't consuming him but was just waiting to be released. "I'll be overhead, watching out for you," he murmured. "Please be careful," Dimitri responded in equal quiet. "I will if you will," Claude reminded him, squeezing his wrist. He waited until the prince nodded, and then he smiled. "I'll see you soon." He turned around and gave Byleth the warmest grin he could manage. He hoped that it would give her a little more confidence, a little more strength in the belief that they would get through this without any one of them dying. Then he hurried off after the others to prepare. "What's that, Claude?" Claude tore the hastily made package open the rest of the way, removing the large, glittering silver shield from within. He stared at it in disbelief for several seconds, feeling the magic pulsing beneath his fingertips. He almost couldn't believe it was real. This is, Gramps. Ivory snorted as Bernadetta leaned over the wall separating her stall from Nico, the young countess's horse. The white wyvern gave her a curious look, then accepted her with presence with a light nicker before returning her attention to her person. This is an Aurora shield, he said a little breathlessly, turning the magnificent piece of smith work over in his hands. There are maybe 4 or 5 in existence. Supposedly Saint Mikul was the one who forged them during Sirius's war against Nemesis. And now I have to take that seriously because I've met Suthies. It's an enchanted shield that protects the wearer from arrows. The rider is possibly close to being invincible if their wyvern or Pegasus is wearing it, only other magic can pierce through the protective barrier it generates. Whoa, Bernadetta's eyes widened, and she stared at it in awe. And it was sent to you. Why, yeah. How did Gramps find this thing, much less pay that messenger to run through empire-infested roads to get it to me? Claude would like to deny it, but his hands were a little shaky as he tapped his fingers against the shimmering surface. As he looked at it, he could see the shifting colors flickering across the metal. He must have found it a while ago, Bernadetta suggested, glancing at him. And offered a lot of gold to that messenger. Your family is really cool, Claude. She sighed, dropping down from the wall and walking over to her horse. Why couldn't I be born to your mother? She mumbled, quietly enough that he probably wasn't supposed to hear her, but did anyways. Gramps, I have to get back and thank you. Taking a cleansing breath, Claude opened the stall and stepped inside, gesturing for Ivory to sit so he could place it on her. Ah, don't feel too bad, Bernie. I'll introduce you and she'll adopt you in no time. What? He could just see Bernie turning bright red at the offer. It's not nice to joke about things like that, Claude. Who says I'm joking? He responded easily, injecting as much seriousness into his voice as he could muster. He heard her squeak again, and when she reappeared over the wall dividing them to stare at him with wide eyes, he smiled warmly at her. His little sister stared wide-eyed at him for a couple of seconds, then tears welled up at the edges of her eyes. Claude made a mental note that, should Count Varley be present at this battle, he would shoot the man in the stomach. It would ensure that he died slowly. Both Ivory and Nico seemed to sense this. Ivory stretched her wing over and patted Bernadetta on the top of her head with it. Moments later, she squeaked when Nico nuzzled her side. He was completely serious. Almira had an old tradition, to ease blood feuds, where the victors of a defeated side would adopt someone who had been damaged by the conflict and make them part of the family. He didn't think even his uncle, his father's still living brother, would raise an eyebrow at him shooting Count Varley full of arrows and bringing Bernadetta home. You joke about a lot of things, but not stuff like this, Lysithea noted, surprising him. He saw her leading Maia by the reins down the main line, Hannah and her Pegasus, a tall, majestic figure with many battle scars, right at her heels. I do have taste, despite what I might lead people to believe, he said with great dignity as he proceeded to bind the Aurora shield to Ivory's chest, one strap at a time. She grunted and nosed him with curiosity. He smacked her shoulder gently to get her to stop. Please don't move, sweetheart, you'll thank me later when I don't have to cut arrowheads out of your stomach. You got a last-minute gift too, Claude? My parents sent me something, I got it the same day we received the ultimatum, actually. Lysithea snorted. Being told about the Agarthans must have spooked them something awful. I hope they didn't spend too much on this. She sounded rather like she knew that was a feeble hope. Hannah's gentle chuckle suggested she agreed with her. That helmet might well save your life if you get knocked off Maia by an arrow, little lady, she said chidingly. It was a sign of how much Lysithea respected the older mercenary woman that she didn't object to that moniker. Your parents want you to come home. No amount of money is too much to try and ensure that. I know, Lysithea said, so quietly Claude almost missed it. Her expression was pained when he glanced over his shoulder. It only lasted a second, though, before she shook her head and set her face in a queenly mask. I'll see you guys in front of Gareg Mach. See you, Claude promised, snapping another buckle shut. Ivory ducked her head, nuzzling his shoulder and crooning in concern. "S okay, girl," he murmured. "I'm just getting worried of things I can't control." Things Byleth can control, to an extent. Does her new powers mean she can use Divine Pulse more than 8 times safely? She said she had new magic, what does that mean? Can. Is she capable of cutting a mountain in half, like Nemesis could do in the legends? A thrill went up his spine. Bloody stars, if she can, maybe we can even win this, instead of just surviving this. Ivory lightly nipped at his hair. He yelped and swatted her side again, giving him an incredulous look. Geez, someone's impatient. He refocused on getting the shield the rest of the way secure, the low hum of chatter in the background both soothing his nerves and reminding him of how much he stood to lose in this fight. There, Nico, I know this armor isn't super comfortable, but I want you to have some protection, so, eep. Marianne, could you help me please? He really doesn't like these leathers, but he needs them, and I'm here, Burn. He's a little anxious, that's all, everyone in here knows that there's trouble coming. Marianne's light footsteps passed into the stall next to him. Moments later, there was a crunch of an apple being pulverized followed by Marianne's gentle cooing. It'll only take a moment, I promise. This is the best way for you to support Burn, all right? I know you want to take care of her. The horse nickered, he stomped his hooves a few times before coming to a stop. Marianne hummed soft, sweet, and peaceably as Bernie made various small noises of awe and leather shuffled and lightly smacked against a fur hide. There's going to be a lot of enemies, Bernadetta murmured, an edge of fear in her voice. So you're going to need all the energy you can get, okay? Eat up. You see? It's no trouble at all, Marianne said, patting Nico on his mane. Claude finished attaching the Aurora shield and gave it a few experimental tugs to ensure that it was fully secure. A purr rumbled in Ivory's throat as he stepped back and patted her muzzle, staring up into the eyes of his stalwart childhood companion. We're going to get through this alive, he promised again, saying the words with his eyes. If he kept saying it, maybe that would guarantee that it was true. Ivory let out a small whine deep in her throat, lowering her head to nuzzle him again. And if he hugged her neck for a few seconds longer than he'd intended to, well, neither Marianne or Bernadetta would sell him out. Releasing her, he hummed and walked to the side of the stall. A spare quiver of arrows, an extra bow in case his brave bow got damaged or broken, an axe and a sword were leaned up against the wall. Exhaling a long breath, Claude began to prepare, strapping the quiver to Ivory's saddle so it was easily in reach, attaching the axe and hanging the bow on the other side and putting the sword away at his hip. He adjusted what other armor his friend had that would protect her without weighing her down, then walked in one final circle around him. Ivory's tail wished as she watched him, golden eyes stern and confident. I'm ready, she told him through her body language. Let us go and watch our enemies fall before us. Prince Khalid of Almira, descendant of war, smirked wryly up at her. That's the spirit. Across from him, Marianne helped Bernadetta up into the saddle. His little sister was wearing pieces of armor that looked like they had to have been sized down to fit her slender frame. She fidgeted and raised her hand to her back as though worried it would obstruct her from reaching her quiver. Seeing as that wasn't the case, she sighed and shifted to make herself as comfortable as possible, taking the reins from Marianne. I'm not ready, she confessed in a small voice. I know I need to be, but it's okay to be scared, Burn, Marianne said quietly. She's right, Claude/Khalid assured her, swinging up onto Ivory's back in one practiced motion. Bernadetta glanced between them as Marianne slipped out of the stall and mounted up on her own horse, Dort. The fine stallion had a green blanket thrown over his back underneath his saddle, to indicate that she was a healer as well as a fighter. Holy knights were greatly prized in warfare, and thus often the first target of enemies. The color indicator was a necessary evil, enabling fellow soldiers who were injured to see and move towards her for healing. Of course, Marianne was no typical holy knight. Khalid could still see her transforming under the light of her crest when he closed his eyes. He pitied the fool who looked at her and saw an easy mark. If he survived her magic and got close to her, they would wish they hadn't in how many seconds they had before her claws dug into his throat. Being brave isn't about not being afraid, Khalid told Bernadetta, quoting word for word what his father had told him after the first live skirmish he'd fought in, when he'd shamefully apologized for freezing up after being splattered in blood and gore. It's about being afraid, having a chance to flee, and choosing to fight instead. And in that, you're a hell of a lot braver than I am, Bernie. Bernadetta stared disbelievingly at him for a moment, before her eyes slowly brightened and she settled her face into controlled fear and determination. Khalid smiled at her and then knocked his heels against Ivory's side, urging her to start walking. Ivory walked out into the hall, Dort and Nico circling right behind her. Beyond them, Khalid saw Ash strapping a lance above an extra quiver to his own armored horse before climbing onto his back, while Happy sat astride her own black horse, waiting for him. "Lead the way, girl," Khalid thought, patting Ivory's neck. They strode out of the stables one after another. Ivory spread her wings and ran a few feet before taking off. Khalid looked down, seeing the sunlight glinting off of Ash's armor and Bernadetta's sword at her side. Swooping over to either side of him were Lysithea and Constance, both clad in Pegasus knight armor. Constance looked remarkably majestic, while Lysithea by contrast looked slightly unfitting, though they at least fit her. Hannah swooped along beside them, wearing comparatively less armor but no less dangerous for it. Her eyes glittered as she looked around them, grimly taking in the children that she would be fighting side by side with. "Well, Claude," Constance said, her usual bravado thankfully restored. "I assume you have glorious strategies worthy of our magnificence for our upcoming foray." "I can think of a few," Claude/Khalid bantered easily. He was both pleased and flattered to see Constance beam with pleasure at this, while even Hannah looked confident. "I don't think they're going to see us coming." "Ha! If they don't make you a priority, they would prove themselves to be fools who deserve to lose." Constance snorted. "You've proven again and again that you're head and shoulders above the rest of us in tactical acumen, even your often lackadaisical attitude can't conceal that. So you worry about being the big strategist, and we'll worry about protecting you," Lysithea said in all seriousness, even as she smirked at him. "Professor's orders," Hannah added sweetly when he opened his mouth to try to respond to this display of faith and confidence. "Well, when you put it like that," he drawled instead, ignoring the way his heart did a backflip. "I have to do everything I can for them. This will be the harshest test I've ever faced. At least my claim about being on pilgrimage to hone my fighting prowess won't be as much of a lie when I return to Almira. Let's go find Seath, shall we? I believe he has general command." "So you believe?" Hannah snorted. "Even he believes you're his superior in this matter. Ask him when we get to the front if you don't believe me." Claude would later deny that his jaw dropped at this admission. He had an image to maintain, after all. It was mind-boggling. Seath was ceding command to him. "Father, were you as terrified as I am now when you realized that you had, in fact, successfully won the throne away from your uncle?" He really should have asked his father more questions before he set out. They flew/cantered to the entrance of Gareg Mach. The area that he'd walked through so many times over the past few months was unrecognizable. The houses were emptied and repurposed into defensive barriers. Old furniture and damaged metal were placed in various tall piles to create barriers that would be difficult to surmise. The towering familiar figures of the bronze golems were placed semi-strategically at the mouth of the two side entrances and multiple yards in front of the middle stairwell into the monastery. Standing in units throughout the small town were many members of the Knights of Sirios, their armor gleaming in the morning light. There were ballistics set up behind various tall walls and on the raised platform before the entrance to the monastery. A few were normal ones, the others were magical. He could see Manuela standing in front of one at the far left side, while the others were manned by people he didn't recognize from this height. A large black wyvern was perched on the edge of the raised wall. That had to be Seath. He'd bet his life on it. In fact, close inspection revealed that all of his classmates and fellow students were standing on the raised platform, in a line in front of Catherine, Shamir, and Lady Rhea, the former acting as her honor guard along with a handful of highly ranked knights. Blowing out a breath, Claude urged Ivory into a dive. He, Lysithea and Constance swooped down and landed on a space that had opened up for them. Sure enough, Seath nodded to them when they turned his way, a lance leaning against his shoulder. "Good to see you," he said. There was a little bit of sympathy in his eyes when he asked, "Are you all prepared for what's coming?" "That's kind of a useless question, isn't it?" Lysithea muttered, before saying in a clearer voice, "We're as ready as we can be, sir." Seath, rather than take offense, just nodded. "I understand, thank you." He turned toward Claude. "The Pegasus Knights here will take orders from you if you have need of them, Claude." Do keep that in mind. I will, he managed when he could get his vocal cords to work. He turned and gave Hannah an incredulous look. She, a seasoned mercenary, was really okay taking orders from a noble brat? She merely gave him a pointed, confident smile in return before leading her Pegasus off to the side to where Rob, resplendent in his hero armor, was waiting. Shaking his head, Claude looked to his other side, searching the crowd for certain someones. Raphael was dressed in the alarmingly light get-up of a grappler, bouncing on his feet with his eyes fixed straight ahead. Ignatz wore the light leather armor of an assassin, bow and quiver strapped over his back, twirling his sword between his hands which crackled with dark magic. Next to him, Flane also wore light armor over her priestess robes, projecting a serene calm that made her seem both very old and very mature in that moment. Honestly, for some reason, looking at her made him think of the statues of Saint Cethline. He wasn't sure where the mental image came from, but it suited her. Past them, Dorothea was pacing back and forth while Linhard tried in vain to get her to stop. Ingrid was astride her Pegasus, standing resolute while speaking in a low voice to Glenn. The latter wore both leather armor and chain mail beneath his sword master robes. As Claude watched them, he reached out and gently grasped Ingrid's wrist, making as if to press something into her hand. Felix, meanwhile, vaulted over the wall when he saw Bernadetta join Leonie on the floor below him where the knights were standing. He slowed to a stop at her side, and Claude was pretty sure he saw his little sister sit up straighter when she saw him. Leonie wasn't the only out in front on horseback. Sylvain was there with her, fire magic swirling around one hand with an axe in his other hand. He'd seen the redhead on Sky Watch, learning how to fly a wyvern, multiple times over the last 3 months. While he wasn't confident enough to fly into this battle, he was close to being better with his axe than he was with a lance. He waved to Ash, Happy and Marianne as they all trotted into place, for once without a joke to ease the tension they all shared. Dimitri was on horseback, on the ground directly in front of him. Dida was standing by his side, wearing the heavy leather armor of a warrior. Alongside him also in a priestess's robes was Mercedes, her hands pressed together in prayer. Annette was perched on the magical ballista not far from Ignatz on the wall. She was leaning on it, fidgeting in place as she stared at the horizon. Occasionally she would glance in Mercedes's direction, mouth out something Claude suspected was a prayer, then stare off into the horizon again. Lawrence was standing with his arms crossed not far away from him, dark mage robes fluttering slightly in the breeze. Balthus stood side by side with Hilda, the former knocking his gauntlets together while the latter planted her relic axe against the stone ground, biting her lip. Bet you're glad that Holst badgered you into accepting that creepy thing now, huh? He thought wryly. Standing behind them, but in front of Rhea and her guard, was Byleth. Her sword master outfit had been exchanged to something roughly equivalent in battle readiness, but pure white and with gold designs of symbols of the Syrios church. If she was uncomfortable in this role, as he knew she was, there was no sign of it in her face. She caught his eye and made herself smile for him, one hand sliding down to the sword of the Creator. Standing right at her side was Atra, still in her familiar dark sword master robes, occasionally glancing at the green-haired girl in a way that made it clear she'd nominated herself as her bodyguard. Yuri was a bit off to the side, where he could easily disappear to wreak some unexpected havoc and backstabbing among their enemy. His armor was light, but he had armor, which suggested that Byleth had snared him and ordered him to put it on. He preferred to go without it, after all. Cyril was standing behind Raphael, axe slung over one shoulder, clearly resisting the urge to tremble. Sir Gilbert was standing on Byleth's left, his eyes constantly straying to where Dimitri was stationed. With his heavy armor, Claude wondered why he wasn't standing on the ground level with the other blue lions. Perhaps he wanted to stay equally close to Annette, to keep an eye on her. Claude grimaced and looked back and forth. So many friends to look out for. So many people to worry about while the fight was raging on. He knew that Byleth and Suthies would do everything in their considerable power to keep everyone alive. That didn't stop him from worrying. Especially about her. I can't risk losing you, please, be careful. He settled in his saddle, patting Ivory's neck. Then he began to wait, along with the others. There was nothing more to be said. They didn't have to wait too long. The sun burned overhead as the first sound of the Empire horns roared in the distance. Ivory's head snapped up, she snarled and pushed up from the sitting position she had been in. Claude rushed to remount, breaking off the planning he'd been doing with Constance with half an apology. Nervous cries echoed all over the wide-open yard within the monastery walls. "Hold firm!" Rhea shouted, her voice projected like a wave of wind, hard, unshakable and authoritative, as though she'd been leading armies all of her life. "You are the protectors of Fodlan's soul, carriers of faith and honor and the way to heaven. Hold firm." When the Empire emerged over the grassy fields and hills from the forest, they appeared like a massive black wave. Claude's throat tightened. There was no better word for it. The sheer number of enemies running toward the walls of Gareg Mach formed a black and red ripple, a wave about to crash against a shore. And that was before they heard the roaring. Demonic beast roars were unmistakable. Claude cursed softly at the sound, even though he'd been expecting it. The ground trembled ever so slightly under the sound of beasts running ahead of the forces. "That's their siege weaponry, I'm willing to bet." The roars echoed out again, and then they were joined by a higher-pitched, screechy call that made his head snap up towards the sky. "Isn't that?" Lysithea started warily. She followed his gaze skyward out in front, where the clouds were dotted by dark specks. Some, Claude realized sourly, upon closer inspection, were bigger than others. "Something tells me certain architects were told to experiment with wings," Claude agreed, before raising his voice. "Don't fly out now, you'll just get shot down. Stay within the walls." "Get ready, Michael Lead," his father's voice echoed in his ears, recalled from all those years ago during that simple skirmish. "Prepare to fight like you want to live." Khalid set his expression in a hard mask of cold amusement. The wave approached the walls, coming almost up to the gates, and then stopped. Just stopped. Even the demonic beasts skidded to a halt, which was more than a little unsettling considering how they usually behaved. The vast black and red covered a large chunk of the field around them, but it had a visible end point. While they were outnumbered to an alarming degree, they were the ones defending in the siege. They were not bereft of advantages. He could hear the golems whirl to life, rolling forward on their wheels several feet. The knights in the various twisting roadways lowered their weapons and closed their visors. Ivory bunched up her muscles, preparing to lift off. Khalid gave Byleth a quick look he hoped conveyed his concern, his determination, and his love for her. Then he looked ahead and drew 2 arrows, waiting. And waiting. Slowly, a rhythmic pounding became audible. Empire, banging lances against the ground in stone. First it was just 1 or 2 rows, but as the minutes dragged on, more and more joined in until it was a rattling din not unlike a raging rainstorm. Jeers and calls of tyrant, beast, and power to the people echoed out from those soldiers mixed in through that racket. Khalid set his jaw, annoyed by the arrogant display, and turned his head toward Annette. "Hey, Annie!" he called out. She jumped at his voice, spinning to stare at him. The demonstration was clearly getting to them, time to do something about that. "Shift the ballista 85 degrees upward, then fire on my mark," he called. He heard Byleth let out a pleased laugh and smirked. Annette, and the rest of the ballistics men, for that matter, scrambled to do so. Turning to the front, he waited for a beat and then shouted, "Now!" Annette grabbed the orb and fired a high-powered spell into it. A ball of fire blasted out of it, flying up over the walls along with an orb of white light in a storm of ballista arrows, before landing with a powerful thud within the lines of the enemies. Screams erupted from the other side, breaking up the intimidation setup. Claude heard the dry grass catch fire, horses breaking and running at the sudden noise and flames. "I don't think so, Edelgard," he thought flatly. A huge cheer erupted from the defenders. Khalid heard not a few calls of his Fodlan name as a chant from the knights. "Reset for Pegasus knights and demonic beasts coming in overhead." He called over the racket nonetheless. Annette smiled gratefully in his direction and did just that. "Well done," Seath said, sounding a little shaken. For a moment the older man had a look on his face like he was lost in a memory. Khalid hoped that he would shake it off. This was not a good place to travel down memory lane. "Don't start praising me yet," the war prince told him, eyes still ahead. Cries of rage echoed from the enemy army, demands for retribution, to charge forward rather than waste time lowering morale. Let them make mistakes. The demonic beasts snarled and pawed at the ground, clearly straining harshly at their leashes. The front line, which he could just barely see through the front gates from his position, opened up. A single figure on horseback approached the gates, their weapon swinging loosely in the air. Claude couldn't see any defining features from there, but he was quickly given the name by the horrified cries of the knights near the front. "It's the Death Knight. The Death Knight is alive." Him. Ugh, damn it, he bounced back from losing his eye. He retrained himself to accommodate for that fast. "So it begins," Rhea declared remotely. There was an undercurrent of rage in her voice, like a caged, starving wyvern just begging to be released. The words couldn't have been better timed. Moments later, the demonic beasts threw themselves against the gates. The iron and steel was dented inward on the impact, stone falling loose from the wall surrounding them. Khalid tsked and clicked his heels against Ivory's side. He could almost see his mount smirk before they hurtled into the air, moving forward. Lysithea and Constance were directly on his heels. "Constance, you're up," he said easily. Constance raised her hand and, with a cold solemnity, snapped her fingers. Bolting was as savage and uncompromising a hit as ever. Siege mages were feared on the battlefield, even when they were ground-bound and their range limited to how fast they could run and having to stay in one location to keep themselves alive. A siege mage on the back of a Pegasus? Khalid was surprised no one else had thought of it. He was pretty sure they were about to give a whole lot of people nightmares for a long time to come. The lighting crashed down on the ground behind the beasts that were ramming the gate. The Death Knight might have gotten hit, or maybe he avoided it. As disturbed as he was, the man was a brilliant warrior and an even better killer. But the brutal blast hit the front lines like the hammer of the heavens, sending foot soldiers scattering in a frantic effort to avoid the magic that had incinerated who knew how many of their comrades. The blazing light of Constance's forgotten crest was hovering overhead, still wearing her sun-solemn expression. She snapped her fingers again, dropping a second bolting as she, Lysithea, Claude and Ingrid flew in formation near the gate the beasts were close to punching through. She aimed the lighting bolt further back into the force of enemies, smashing another massive crater in the middle of it and starting a fire that began to spread across the dried grass. That blaze would quickly burn out of control if Edelgard didn't take the time to do something about it. Good. That was a happy accident, if it had rained at any point over the last 2 weeks. His keen eyes caught sight of a formation that his father had drilled into him from the day he came home with Ivory in tow. "Archers, guys, archers. Drop down," he warned. Lysithea cussed before the 4 of them dropped into a dive. Seconds later, a hail of arrows flew over their heads and landed semi-harmlessly in the ground. Moments later, the demonic beasts burst through the gates like they were so much tinder. Lysithea was on them in seconds. She threw Seraphim down at the leader, burning into his back and dropping him to the ground. Constance switched over to Sagitt while Ingrid pulled out the blessed lance the Blue Lions had won from the Battle of the Eagle and Lion seemingly an eternity ago. "Cover me, Claude," she shouted as she continued to dive. "On it," he promised, pressing his left heel into Ivory's side. She snorted and banked hard, allowing him to fire a litany of arrows at the 2 beasts who were bringing up the rear. It didn't do them serious harm, but it did cause them to skid to a halt. That was precisely what Ingrid needed. She flew down until her Pegasus's hooves were practically grazing the fur on its back and rams the lance into its neck. The blessing caused it to pierce straight through the magical barrier, the flesh and the bones in one smooth blow. She pulled it out and then stabbed the neck again in rapid succession, this time forcing it all the way down through the neck, severing it from its body. Then she was flying onward, leaving it to die on the road as she banked and started to turn. Claude flew around after her, watching Lysithea and Constance hammer another one of those demonic beasts into submission. And then his eyes caught a massive blaze of gold coming from the direction of the monastery. "Hey guys, pull back!" he yelled, knowing precisely what it meant. They obeyed him without question, getting well out of the way of the heart and soul of their forces. Byleth let out a wordless shout and swung the blade of the Creator's sword upward. The blast of magic generated by the attack formed a massive golden scythe, tearing up the main road to the gates. The beast that saw it couldn't move out of the way. It vanished within that power, which crashed through the gate and consumed the first 2-3 dozen men who'd been charging through that gate. The shock wave from the attack, even after it dissipated, sent dozens more flying like ragdolls. Khalid pulled back up half a dozen feet, looked into the sky around him, and let out a breath. Then he casually turned to the right and shot his brave bow twice. The arrows slammed into two different Pegasus knights, dropping them like flies. He winced at their screams which cut off when they hit the ground. That didn't exactly thin things out. The Empire was famous for their Pegasus knights, and that was obvious with the knights flying his way. Of course, he wasn't alone either. Lysithea dodged past a knight and threw Luna at her back, causing her and her mount to vanish into the creepy spell and become nothing. Hannah swooped in and cut off another knight that had designs on Constance, who cast bolting once again aimed at the army outside the gates, splitting them up further and destroying their cohesion, sparking more fires and spreading chaos in the back ranks. Just as planned, Khalid thought with a grim sort of relief. That should buy us some time. How much, who knows, with Edelgard to hold them together. A screech alarmingly close to him forced him to abandon that line of thought. He wheeled around and saw the two bird demonic beasts flying toward him. There was so little comparison between these new creatures and the sky fiends that Claude recognized that he knew right away. This was part of Thales's contribution to Edelgard's invasion attempt. They were elongated, with longer bodies and massive wingspans, feathers like lances and talons as big as a tall man's whole body. Their heads were massive, formed into a creepy mask that covered all but the long, lance-like beak. They let out an unnatural screech as they approached him. Khalid snorted and clicked his heels against Ivory's side again. Fear will keep you alive, let it lie beneath your strength, his father's voice echoed as he flew faster, darting around them and firing arrows at the wings as their massive bodies twisted in an attempt to keep up. His eyes were trained on the wings. He hit one right in the middle membrane, causing it to screech. Of course, while it dropped several feet, its friend wasn't so. He didn't even get to finish that thought before a golden blast from the ground flew upward like a spike bursting out of the ground, ripping the beast in half like a wet piece of parchment. Goddess, Byleth. You better not be alone down there, I swear, or you're going to get a lecture when I have to give Ivory a break. Spinning an arrow, Claude aimed while Ivory flew over the beast he'd injured. He fired the dual arrows down at its other wing. The impact shattered the magic barrier and caused it to fall to the ground, screaming in agony. Looking out at the sky, Claude searched for another flying demonic beast. They're a problem unlike the ones stuck on the ground. They can fly over our defenses and attack the ballistics, attack the healers and mages before swooping away. We need to make sure they're occupied. Ah, there's one. He wheeled 45 degrees and urged Ivory into a charge in a straight line, heading for one that had designs on Constance, the mage being preoccupied making the various commanders' lives difficult. Below them, the black and red mass of the Imperial army was beginning to pour into the monastery grounds. They quickly found themselves bottlenecked by the blockades Yuri had painstakingly placed in all the important roads. A volley from the friendly ballistics came to their aid immediately. The demonic beast caught a magic blast to the side, not quite debilitating. It hadn't been a good hit, but it slowed it down and did significant damage to his side. Khalid shifted in the seat, lined up two arrows and whistled sharply at Ivory. His wyvern snarled, shooting forward. She flew underneath the struggling beast, narrowly missing its angry swipes and wing beats, and spun herself in a corkscrew. Khalid saw the red flash where the magic barrier had been burnt through, leaving the stomach vulnerable, and fired two anti-beast head arrows at near point blank. When Ivory shot past and righted herself, he felt the air pressure from the badly injured beast dropping to the ground, just narrowly missing them, falling to where it would be easily finished off by the ground troops. I'll end this. Ingrid shouted behind him. The cry of a feminine voice followed by a crash caused him to glance over his shoulder. The Pegasus that had been headed in his direction instead nickered in dismay and flew down after its rider. Ingrid, a few feet away from that spot, waved at him. Don't worry, I've got your back. Thanks. He shouted back, scanning the sky for a new target. The battle was just beginning. Chapter 48. Allow me to demonstrate. If Nemesis had always felt like this, like he was a god walking on the mortal earth, that he could reshape it with the twist of his wrist, then perhaps the fact that he fell from grace was no surprise. As Byleth swung the sword of the Creator again, straight down the road toward the massive wave of infantry enemies, she was glad more than ever that she had Suthies by her side. Golden light flared and burst forward, tearing across the ground and through the soldiers like a farmer's scythe cutting wheat. The light was so intense Byleth winced and narrowed her eyes a bit against it. She could hear screaming and warnings not to look coming from elsewhere, so clearly she had some sort of buffer against it. She looked at the devastation caused by the fully awakened sword of the Creator through the falling dust, and might have gawked if she were a more outwardly emotional girl. The blow hadn't completely destroyed the street in front of her, but it had carved deep grooves in it, rendering the road uncrossable by all but the most athletic horses, and many of the Empire solders who had been standing in front of her were just gone. Vanished like they'd never existed, except for ash fluttering down from the sky. Suthis, please, don't let me go mad with this power. Of course I won't, Suthis said. Byleth felt a light thwop at the back of her head, a chastisement if there ever was one. Now stay focused. Right. Rob and Hugo dashed past her, their armor catching the corner of her eyes as they set upon a battalion of axe-wielding men, tearing through them with more ferocity than they'd applied to a job in a long time. Among all the chaos, screaming and crashing, seeing them was a relief. As she moved off to the side to support a faltering group of knights trying desperately to reinforce an alleyway, she saw Justine whirl past, Thoron blasting through the chest plate of a knight she used as a jumping-off point to thrust her levin sword upward, casting a thunderbolt up at a Pegasus knight above. The electricity was conducted by the knight's armor, searing the soft flesh beneath and causing her to fall from her mount with a chopped-off scream. Juno appeared from around the corner in the blink of an eye, throwing a blistering series of haymakers and punches on a helpless archer who'd been attempting to commandeer a ballista from a fallen monk. He didn't even last a full 10 seconds. Pointing her hand out, Byleth cast aura as she ran. The blaze of white magic struck the dark bishop that had taken aim at Juno's back, giving her time to spin around and lunge at him next. Darting through the alleyway with speed she'd not possessed before, how much had fusing with Suthis's heart changed her? She was running on instinct, hadn't had a time to patiently test herself. She caught up with those knights and shouted, "Get down!" They obeyed her to a man, and she swung the sword of the Creator in a wide arc. The knights who had been crowding forward, lances and swords thrusting, had no time to move before the crackle of goddess-given power smashed into them and sent them flying like so many ragdolls. Byleth let out a relieved sigh and weaved among the injured, exhausted knights, kneeling in order to heal the worst of their injuries. She did her best to ignore the odd, reverent looks they gave her and the way some of them attempted to bow to her despite the situation. "I'll call for reinforcements to be sent this way," she promised before sheathing the sword and leaping up, digging her feet into the wall and propelling herself up onto the small house's roof. Now elevated from the ground, she could look out across the battlefield and adjust her current plans to accommodate for the changes. The scene was, well, it wasn't as grim as it, by all rights, should have been, but it wasn't good. After all, no one defender in a siege battle saw any good in there being a gaping hole in their defensive walls that the enemy could filter through. Fortunately the Empire advance was slowed to an absolute crawl, and it was thanks to Claude and Constance. The fires they had started with the latter's opening bolting attacks were now raging out of control, the flames so tall they were licking the upper edges of Garag Mach's walls. Unless the Imperial army wanted to be consumed, or choked to death on the sheer amount of smoke filling the air, they had to wrestle control over the blaze, wasting precious resources in the process, possibly including water. So only a third of the Empire's best men were able to slowly trickle their way through the opening created by the demonic beasts. Of course that was still a third of the biggest army in Fodlan. The fighting within the streets and the plaza in front of the monastery was thick and fierce. The golems were creating little pockets of defensible land, their holy lances just as effective against her current enemies as they'd been against her students, more so, even, since many of the knights approaching them didn't know what they were or what they were capable of until it was too late. The sky was thick with Pegasus knights. It seemed like Claude, Lysithea, Constance, Ingrid, Hannah, Seath, and the rest of the airborne troops had wiped out the flying demonic beasts for now. They were continuing to fight, arrows and magic flying through the air. Thankfully Claude and Lysithea at least were easy to spot due to their eye-catching mounts. They at least seemed to be managing for now. Finding the rest of her students, that was more of a challenge. The grounds were engulfed in fighting, a blur of mud, blood, and flickering flames. It was only the brightly colored uniforms her friends wore beneath their armor that could draw her eye to their location. She found Balthus first, fighting side by side with a filthy but energetic Hilda. They were more or less back to back, forming a whirlwind of death down one of the side streets assisted by Gustav from his horseback. They were pretty badly outnumbered, however. Grimacing, Byleth glanced to her right, then her left, then put her heel down and jumped. The ground beneath her blurred. A few moments later she slammed down on the roof of the house across the road from where she'd been standing before. Her knees barely buckled on the impact. Drawing her sword again, Byleth let out a high, sharp whistle, the old Almiran stand by her father had picked up years ago. Gustav, Hilda, and Balthus both looked up, grinned, and scrambled backwards as she jumped from the thatched roof in front of the rows of Empire soldiers and dark mages. "Are some of you Agar then? Take this back to your masters." She cast aura at the ground. The explosion caused dirt to fly upward in a shockwave that knocked the first dozen men backwards. "Hilda," she called over her shoulder. She could see the Pinkette smirk without humor without turning around. "Oh my way," she blurred past Byleth, free kugel blazing with bloody red light amidst its golden rays. The men who had passed by the ranks of their disoriented brothers in arms jerked back in horror when she came to a stop and raised the relic axe over their head. "That's enough." She fired at them as she brought the axe down. Apocalypse was a word used to describe the full power of the Goneril family's relic weapon. Unlike the magic mist that obscured Failnaugh's wielder from view while leaving their vision perfectly clear, the guaranteed savaging that Irhbar inflicted on its victims without fail, the perfect accuracy over obscene distance that the Thyrsus staff provided those who had the Gloucester crest or the madness that dwelled within Blutrang, the power within Free Kugel was straightforward. It crushed everything within several yards into oblivion, leaving only a blasted crater behind. Byleth felt the blowback from the impact. Hilda's silhouette nearly vanished briefly within the flare of light. The noise was beyond description, it even swallowed up the local chaos of the battlefield. Heat blew against her face, and then a few seconds later it was over. When she blinked light out of her eyes, she could see Hilda straightening up, Free Kugel swinging by her side as she looked out at what few enemies were still standing in front of her. A massive crater was blasted into the ground where their enemies had been standing moments ago, ash and blackened cloth scattered throughout it. The Pinkette was green in the face, clearly trying hard not to think about what she'd just done. Instead she jutted her chin out and glared defiantly at her would-be killers. "Who's next?" she asked. Their answer, "Break and flee." It made Balthus chuckle, clapping a hand on Byleth's shoulder. "I think we got this now, thanks Professor. Need a leg up?" he asked. Byleth turned around and gave him a quick once-over, just to make certain that he wasn't hurt. Gustav saw this and smiled at her, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. Glancing just past him revealed Falri, hard at work healing a number of knights. She looked up just long enough to give her child charge an encouraging smirk. "Yes please." Balthus knelt and braced his gauntlet-glad arms out in front of them. Byleth jumped off of them and climbed back up onto the rooftop. She saw a Pegasus knight flying her way. Without hesitation she grabbed the sword, unsheathed it and swung it upward. The arcing light sliced off the animal's wing, both it and the rider fell to the ground. Byleth grimaced, forcing down the sick feeling in her gut as she looked away across the battlefield. There are so many people, she thought bleakly as she desperately searched for her students, her friends, throughout the burning chaos. How can I possibly save them all? All you can do is save as many as you can, Suthes responded solemnly. As I did, when Agartha burned the world with their weapons. Byleth felt her chest tighten at the reminder of what was at stake. What would, happen, how many more innocents would die, if they didn't defeat Edelgard and destroy Thales whom she was empowering. There. Suthes gasped urgently, out to the southeast. Her head snapped in that direction, and then she was running, jumping from roof to roof. Marianne had gotten herself pinned in a back street, her mobility greatly reduced. While trying to heal fellow soldiers, Ash was trying to get to her, but armored knights were blocking his way and striking at his horse in an attempt to kill it. He was acquitting himself very well. 2 armored knights were dead on the ground, arrows expertly fired through the narrow slits of their visors, but there were 3 assassins bedeviling Marianne who'd had to dismount to keep up with them. What was worse was that Byleth could see Marianne shuddering, along with a flickering dark blue light around her from her crest. Setting her teeth, she threw herself over a roof until she was right above her blue-haired friend and pointed her hand, casting thunder down on the one of the assassin's head. His steel armor spread the blow throughout his whole body. He dropped, twitching erratically where he lay, while Marianne's head snapped up. The transformation that had been creeping up on her stopped just after turning her arm into an elongated claw. Lunging forward, she grabbed one of her tormentors by the head and bashed it against the wall, before casting Nosferatu. The white light and a splash of gore painted the stones, and when Marianne pulled her hand back, the claws and scales warped back into her human hand. Byleth jumped down into the alley, glancing over her shoulder to check on Marianne's patients. They all seemed to be alive except for two, and happily, none of them seemed to have noticed her momentary transformation. "Thank you, Professor," Marianne said as she grabbed Dort's reins. "Where did you come from?" "Up," she responded factually and slightly playfully. The words startled a laugh out of Marianne as she remounted, which was good. Byleth then turned around to head back to help Ash. However, that was rendered unnecessary by two things in quick succession. Marianne bolted past her, Thoron blazing in one hand. When she turned the corner, Byleth saw her point her hand at one of the two remaining knights still forcing Ash back and shouted, "I have to do this." Poor bastard didn't even get a chance to turn around before the magic fried him through his armor. That gave Ash the maneuverability he'd needed. Slinging his bow over his back, he drew a killer lance he'd picked up somewhere and rammed it through one of the chinks in his opponent's armor. The impact tore muscle and artery, and Ash trotted past his now fallen enemy to rejoin Marianne, relief flooding the parts of his face that weren't obscured by his helmet. "Marianne! Marianne!" Ingrid's voice echoed from overhead. The three of them looked up to see the blonde Pegasus knight looking down at them. Relieved, she pointed her lance further down the field and said, "Flane's swamped with injured, Linhardt's on the other side of the battlefield, he can't get to her soon enough. Go and lend her some support. Ash, can you go help Sylvain and Leonie? They're trying to slow the reinforcements coming through the broken gate, but they've got little backup." "Okay," Marianne cried. "Ingrid, can you give me a lift?" Byleth called as Ash rushed off after his new fiancée, before the girl could fly off. "I need to see where I'm needed most." In lieu of responding verbally, Ingrid swooped down and landed momentarily at her side. Accepting her offered hand, Byleth swung up onto the saddle and held onto the blonde's shoulders as they lifted off. "Claude sent me back," Ingrid explained. "How is he?" Byleth asked, before quickly casting thunder at an approaching Pegasus knight. Ingrid threw a javelin when that only staggered their enemy. The second impact dropped her. There was a distinct flare of very light blue light along the javelin before it was thrown, her crest strengthening the impact beyond what it might have been otherwise. "His crest is keeping him safe and strong," Ingrid assured her, nodding at the general skyline. Byleth gave herself a moment to look through the late afternoon sky, squinting against glare until she caught sight of a familiar white wyvern spinning in a circle around another one of those winged demonic beasts. Seconds later, a black dot that could only be Lysithea flew up from the ground, seraphim flashing across the sky and hitting the monster in the wing, burning through the limb and causing it to crash to the ground. "Good to know, where's Dimitri? I haven't seen him for a while." Which might well be hours at this point. Byleth had lost any sense of time as the siege dragged on, only vaguely aware of its passage thanks to the position of the sun. She's been rushing from one end of this battlefield to another, burning 5 divine pulses so far to keep everyone's head above water, and she was starting to lose track of who was where. "He's fighting near the open gate," he was with Sylvain, but they got cut off from each other. "Right, take me there. Maybe I can try to do something about that entranceway while I'm there." "If you say so," Ingrid said, a little worry in her voice. "Hang on, we're going up to avoid archers." Byleth swallowed and tightened her grip on her friend as her Pegasus nickered and them shot upward like a cork. They flew across the field for a brief minute, Byleth casting thunder at the other enemy knights who had similar ideas about avoiding Ash, Ignatz, Bernadetta, and Shamir, to name a few. Ingrid was muttering prayers to herself, all in Old Fodlanes. Faerghus nobles all learned the old tongue, since it was believed to have been the language Sirios and Suthies spoke to each other. Her Pegasus arced over a number of arrow shows. Byleth's stomach lurched when the projectiles whipped past. That was so close, when Ingrid broke off and cursed, "There! He's there!" She swooped down. Byleth's stomach lurched when she saw what the blonde had seen. Dimitri wasn't alone, mercifully, Atra was with him, guarding his back. He'd given up his horse to a wounded soldier who had been led away by a knight, and was fighting ferociously on foot. As they dived, Atra swung her fire sword up, the wave of flames shooting across the ground and hitting a mage, causing their robes to combust. The twosome were surrounded on either side by knights, pinned in a corner away from the gate. Looking down from the sky, Byleth could see Glenn, Felix, and Bernadetta struggling to get to them past some mages and the fires they had started. It's a miracle no one's passed out from smoke inhalation. I know that the Empire forces outside haven't been so lucky. Drop me on the roof, she told Ingrid, swinging her leg off the side of the saddle. The blonde made a slight disbelieving noise but did as she ordered, swooping just low enough for her to make the jump. Shoving off, Byleth landed with a thud and unsheathed the sword. "Dimitri, Atra, move!" she shouted. Her prince glanced up for a second, spotted her, and quickly jumped back, shoving Atra backward right before doing so. Byleth then jumped down onto the muddy, blood-soaked earth, a stomach-churning squelch echoing from under her boots, and channeled magic through the blade just as Hilda had done with her axe not long ago. "Here is something to believe in," she shouted, more for the sake of what few knights were still alive this close to the wall, before unleashing the sword's power. The impact obliterated the house wall that had formed half of the narrow passageway. She heard rocks crumble and shingles crack over the chopped-off screams of men and horses. The light faded a few moments later, revealing that she'd incinerated half of the house to her left more cleanly than the most violent forest fire, digging a massive curve into the ground for 20 yards out in front of her. What few had survived her attacks were stumbling out of the way, many having fallen over. The knights on the opposite side of the gate cheered loudly at the sign of her proximity before rallying again. Byleth let out a harsh breath. "I hope the people who owned that house didn't leave too many valuables behind," she thought inanely, and spun around, frantically looking for Dimitri. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, stumbling in the heavy mud and nearly falling to her knees. Then an arrow hit her in the shoulder. Gasping, she dropped to one knee. "Byleth!" Dimitri's voice echoed from the smoke in front of her, followed moments later by a corpse falling off of a nearby rooftop. A sniper, ironically now with an arrow buried in his neck. "I'm fine," she rasped as her prince pulled her to his feet, terror in his eyes. She clasped his face reassuringly. Now that she was over the shock, she noted that the pain was far less than she remembered similar injuries causing her previously. "They hit my off arm." "You need to get to Linhard," Dimitri fretted, before pushing her down and ducking. A blast of sickening dark magic, either miasma or banshee, it went by too quickly to tell, whipped over their heads and crashed into the wall. He's back at one of the defensive lines." "Oh, you mean you noticed you'd overreached?" Byleth asked him in exasperation as Atra zipped past them, cutting the mage's hand with one sword and impaling him with the other in as many seconds. She pointed her finger and cast thunder at the knight approaching the renegade Agarthan, allowing her to focus on the other mages. "Save lecturing me for when you don't have an arrow in your back," the blonde half snapped, half pleaded, leading her over some rubble and the corpses of a couple of knights. "And you? Where did all that blood come from, Dimitri?" Byleth demanded after casting fire at another sniper trying to stake out another rooftop vantage point. He staggered backwards, then got struck down by another arrow. She heard a horse neighing over the chaos. "Bernadetta?" "It's my enemies," he said, rather unemotionally by his standards. "Don't you dare lie to me right now," she rasped, giving him a pointed look. "I've pulled a muscle, at least," Dimitri amended slightly. Atra turned around long enough to give him an incredulous look before promptly getting distracted by a pair of mounted knights. "Ah, hand me that javelin, Byleth." She did, and Dimitri took half a step forward before throwing it. The discarded weapon hit one of Atra's incoming opponents in the neck. While perhaps their armor had saved them, the impact of bladed strength sent them falling from the horse. Atra jumped out of the way of the other knight's charge, disarmed them of their lance with her twin swords, and then slashed the connecting buckles of the saddle. The leather slipped sideways, causing the knight to fall and dangle off the side of their horse, who promptly took off out of fear, dragging them along like a toy. "There's so many of them," Atra panted when the two of them caught up with her. Byleth gently placed a hand on her forehead, casting heal on the nasty wound over her eyes. "Unless we can somehow close off that hole in the wall for a while, I don't know how long we can do this." "I know, Byleth acknowledged with a sympathetic wince, moving her hand to heal the nasty bruising in the other girl's ribs. Dmitri meanwhile had taken point, slinging a bow off of his shoulders and shooting down a mage that had tried to creep up on them. "Let's get back to Linhard, and I'll try to think of a solution." "There he is, the Prince of Faergus." The voice made Byleth curse ferociously and turn again while Atra tensed up all over except her legs. They had just passed into a larger street, and now the three of them were facing an entire battalion of warriors. Much more worryingly, however, the man at the head of the pack wore ornate armor and a medal that indicated he was a general in the Imperial Army. He had a massive silver axe that had obviously been reforged for extra strength. They didn't have any distance support, but they outnumbered the three of them by a wide margin. "Prince Vlad did. By order of Her Majesty, Emperor Ediglard of Adrestia, I demand your unconditional surrender," the man declared, pointing his axe at them. "Surrender and give up the servants of Rhea. I may intercede for your life to be spared." "Is that a joke?" Dmitri snarled back, his rage ricocheting off the walls of the smoke-filled alley. Byleth tried to grab his wrist, but a muscle seized up by the arrow in her shoulder made her just miss him as he stormed forward. "I'll throw your head to that witch straight over these walls." Atra cursed and quickly darted to the far side of the wall as Dmitri charged. She spun her flame sword and then swung upward, causing a line of flame to cut across the ground into the battalion and forcing them to scatter out of formation. Dmitri casually grabbed the closest man by the head and slammed it into the wall, causing a wince-inducing crack before he fell like a broken marionette. The general rushed him and brought his axe down in an overhead arc. Dmitri stopped him by grabbing the length of his lance with his hand, not unlike what he did to the Death Knight many months ago. Twisting his wrist as it glowed with the light of the royal crest, Dmitri snapped the weapon in half before grabbing an arrow out of his quiver and stabbing the man in the shoulder with it. Shoving him away and to the ground, the prince ducked under another axe and swiped the broken axe head off the ground before slamming it into his foot. As the man screamed, Dmitri pulled his leg out from under him, swung him across the ground and then threw him into one of his fellow warriors. Both of them were flung into the wall with enough force to crack the stone. Byleth wasn't idle. She hurried forward and cast Balganon, catching a warrior and forcing the others to back up and get shot full of ghostly arrows. Relief swept over Byleth as Bernadetta hurtled around the corner, arrows drawn on her killer bow as she took aim. Seconds behind her was Felix, blurring forward to stab a warrior while Glenn disarmed the other and slammed the hilt of his sword into the other's face. With one final strike from Atra, the alley was mostly empty except for the general, who looked stunned at the turnaround. "Thank you for reminding me why I'm never allowed to let you go anywhere by yourself," Glenn snapped at Dmitri. The prince was allowed about a second to be confused by that comment before the filthy, older Frildarius brother shot across the alleyway and embraced him tightly. "Idiot brat, what kind of plan was that?" "Gee Glenn," Dmitri stammered, shocked. "What did you just call me? 4 years and I still have to take care of you two brats." The blue-haired boy laughed, pushing the prince back a bit and studying him intensely for injuries. Just beyond him, Bernadetta and Atra were going after the general, who'd fled when he realized how badly he'd miscalculated. "But of course, you never bloody listened to me about strategic retreats. Why would you start now?" "Gee Glenn, why you are remember." The prince choked out. Byleth smiled wanly, her gaze falling over Glenn and Felix. The younger brother looked like he was trying to maintain his usual cool, but his shaky hands were telling. "Only a handful of things," Glenn acknowledged. "Not even the majority, I don't think, but I do remember an important thing about my little brat brothers, to never leave you alone when the battlefield's on fire." He ruffled the prince's hair. Dmitri let out a weak, choked-off sob and clutched Glenn's hand tightly. Felix made a face and snapped, "Don't call me that, I'm not a kid anymore." The wobble in his voice slightly undermined his usual ire. "Yeah, you got a lot grumpier," Glenn retorted teasingly. Gee guys. This is really sweet, but we need to fall back to Linhard." "The professor's hurt," Bernadetta protested, having returned to the alley alongside Atra. The latter gave Byleth an apologetic look, suggesting the general got away, before helping her up onto Nico's back just behind her petite student. "All right," Dmitri gulped, his rage all but completely vanishing beneath a shaky tearful smile. The 4 on-foot warriors formed a rear guard for Bernadetta as she urged her horse through the narrow pathways to the safe area, dozens of yards back. It was a somewhat large clearing with a large blessed circle at the end of a long stone pathway. Usually it was a prayer circle surrounded by a garden, but of course it didn't look anything like that right now. Linhard was on his hands and knees, casting heel on a badly mangled sniper, eyes shut in concentration. Both the grass and the stone were covered in stretchers where knights were either unconscious or recovering. Sitting on the edge of the garden gulping down blessed pure water to restore her magic was a slightly grey-faced Constance in her Pegasus. Guarding the area was a somewhat damaged magic golem. Meanwhile, a completely broken one was standing with his arms hanging limp multiple yards away where Didu and Hugo were faithfully standing guard. "Professor!" Constance cried. She hurriedly finished off the pure water she'd been chugging and stepped carefully between the groaning bodies to reach her, hand glowing. Linhard must have taught her heal on the fly so she could provide what help she could. "Here, let me help you." "I'll be with you in a minute, Dimitri, Felix," Linhard said. He sounded surprisingly alert considering how many patients he had. His hands were glowing with the light of the crest of Cethline as he finished sealing the gaping wound in the sniper's chest. The man gasped for breath, his eyes widening when he realized he could breathe without unspeakable pain anymore. He babbled his thanks as the green-haired boy stood up, brushing off his pants. His gloves were stained with blood. Despite this and his deep-seated fear of gore, his face was stoic and calm. "How bad is it?" he questioned, as Constance and Atra went to work getting the arrow out of Byleth's shoulder. She gritted her teeth as they worked, refusing the offer of a cloth to bite on with a muttered, "Doesn't hurt that much. It's not serious, just my leg, I landed on it wrong at some point," Dimitri explained, sitting heavily on an available chair. "Glenn and Felix are hurt too, you can tend to them first." You did more than just land on it wrong, Your Highness, I'm pretty sure you stepped on burning coals one time too many," Linhard said bluntly, kneeling in front of him and lifting his leg up a bit. Byleth hissed furiously at the sight of her prince's blistered, bloody foot. "You need a new boot, can someone get me one?" "How the hell did you not notice that?" Felix asked. It sounded like he was trying to sound exasperated, but instead he seemed both irritated and worried. Adrenaline, I suppose." Dimitri had the good grace to sound contrite. At least, he gave them an apologetic look. Constance murmured, "There you go," a moment later as she finished healing Byleth's shoulder. She squeezed her hand in gratitude and straightened up, staring at the sky for a moment. She saw both Hannah, who was descending, hopefully just to give her Pegasus a chance to catch her breath, closer to the monastery entrance, and Seath, who was swooping down in her direction. She hurried out to meet him, leaving Linhard to care for Dimitri while a knight she didn't recognize hurried over with new boots in his arms. "Professor," Seath said easily when he landed and she came to a halt by his wyvern's side. He was quite bloody, the glowing blessed lance of Sikal in his hand. Byleth took half a second to marvel at how sleek, beautiful, and elegant the saint's weapon was in comparison to the relics. "I wonder why they look so different. We're holding out very well, but it can't last at this rate. The opening in our gate is allowing the Empire to make good use of their numbers even as they fight the forest fires." "I know," Byleth acknowledged, racking her brain for as she stared just past him at the broken-down golem. "We need to plug it with something." A plan began to blossom in her mind, a plan that made Suthies chuckle. "Something big." She nodded meaningfully down the ruined street. Seath glanced over his shoulder, and his face immediately lit up with thought. "It could work, if we're able to move it," he said. "Dimitri, perhaps, could lift it, but we would have to get it down to the front. Which would be difficult." Byleth frowned for a moment, thinking furiously. Her mind strayed back to an old job that her father had led the mercenaries on. They had to storm a minor fort on the edges of the Empire that had been overrun by bandits, and needed a way to force the gates open. What her father had come up with was, "Then we'll launch it over," she said with a burst of inspiration. "Some of the ballistae are on wheels, right? We can spare 2 to be brought close together." Seath blinked twice, then smiled at her. "Indeed, and 2 of them will have the strength to pitch at the distance we need. Aim will be key, however. Find Ignatz and tell him I need his eyes. Bring him back here yourself if you can," Byleth asked, putting the sword away at her side. I'll coordinate the ballista. The older man nodded shortly and took off again. Turning around, Byleth said, Constance, can you go up and tell Claude the plan? I don't want to surprise any of our air forces. Consider it done, Professor, the elegant young woman promised, before clicking her tongue. Her Pegasus, looking refreshed after pulling his head out of a bucket of water, trotted over to her and let her saddle up. Moments later she was in the air again. With that, Byleth nodded back at Dmitri before rushing back, heading down the roadway to the entrance of the monastery. Mercedes was in the middle of the first road, guarded by a cadre of knights after being separated from Didu encasing fortify on sweeping lines of injured troops, allowing them to return to the fray instantly. She smiled bravely when Byleth ran close, running her new plan out to the man controlling it. The professor stopped by her side long enough to give her a tight hug. Despite how exhausted she knew Merci had to be, and how much she hated war, she showed no signs of defeat. Byleth also waved to Annette, who was still on the magic ballista as she went and said the same to the ballista man on her right. Several painfully long minutes later, the two ballistae were lined up while Dmitri dragged the massive broken golem along behind him. He had some help from Hugo, Balthus, and Hilda who'd made their way back at some point, but it was likely he was doing most of the work. As they scrambled all over to recalibrate the machines for their new loading, Seath appeared, swooping down from the sky and letting Ignatz slide off his back. The young assassin looked significantly less beat up than most of the others Byleth had seen so far. He'd been using his size and maneuverability to stay out of danger while doing what damage he could. He stared wide-eyed at the setup for a moment before biting his lip and taking a determined look as he walked around and took control of the trigger mechanisms. Byleth watched with anxious anticipation as the ballistae shifted, lifting the golem with them. Ignatz looked up at the sky, tilting his head slightly, making a calculation in his mind. Then he pulled the trigger. It was amazing to watch the broken golem go flying. It was so big, and so heavy, it was a testament to how strong and well-made the ballistae were that they could fling the thing in such a high arc. There was a bit of a hush, a moment of silence, over the battlefield as the golem flew over their heads. Then there was a ground-shaking crash in the distance. For a second Byleth feared they had missed, or even hit some of their own men, but then she heard a huge roar of cheers and calls of, "Glory to the goddess and her chosen," echoing from the front of the line, applause and taunts being thrown at the Imperial army outside the gate. They had made the shot. Byleth slumped in relief. Suthies, meanwhile, giggled at Ignatz's stunned look as everyone around him erupted into cheers and showered praise on him. That's bought us some time, at least. But how much? Chapter 49. The entrance was sealed, for now. The Empire soldiers within the walls were demoralized by the realization that they were cut off, but they were still fighting like demons possessing the corpses of people. What that woman could have done to inspire such fanaticism in them, Dmitri couldn't fathom. But that wasn't the chief concern in his mind as he dove down the broken, rubble-strewn streets, gripping his silver lance tightly as he scanned the battlefield and listened for screaming. The Death Knight had made it past the walls, and was killing his way toward the front of the monastery where the Archbishop was, where Byleth was catching her breath. He and Byleth were the only ones he truly trusted to fight that animal. He had to find the monster before he managed to locate any of their healers, or Ignatz, or Annette. With all the shouting, rallying and general chaos all around, he couldn't find anyone to stop and ask if they'd seen the monster. He somewhat regretted lending his horse to the healers, even though he knew it was the only thing he could have done. He could fight on foot well enough, though the trade-off was that it was harder to get around the streets. An Empire soldier attempted to charge him. Dmitri scoffed, dodged to the side letting the sword swipe past him and slammed his fist into the man's face. The power of his crest flowed freely through his muscles. The Myrmidon dropped like a rock, allowing him to move on without stopping. There were bodies strewn all over the place, knights and Imperials alike. The smell of smoke stung his throat, and the fires crackling both within and without the walls filled him with an intense nausea. Dmitri was fairly certain the only reason he wasn't disappearing inside himself, as Bernadetta had called it, could purely be put down to his desperate, burning need to keep Byleth, Claude, and Glenn safe, which he couldn't do drowning in the red. Even with that keeping his head above water, the corners of his eyes were blurry and hazy, and he didn't dare look at the fires for too long lest knee-jerk panic and rage steal what little serenity he'd managed to hold onto. A couple of the knights of Sirios were weakly trying to hold off a number of Imperial cavalry directly ahead of him. They were clearly exhausted, their armor battered and sooty. Dmitri grimaced and rushed forward, reaching the broken battalion moments after one of the cavalry cut their leader down. The prince grabbed the lance in his free hand when the mounted knight tried to claim another victim. With a casual jerk of his shoulder, he wrenched the man clean off his horse to the ground before taking the now freed lance and stabbing one of the others. Their companion on the far left threw a javelin at him. Dmitri managed to avoid getting impaled, but the blade still cut a painful scar along the upper part of his arm. Hissing in aggravation, he jumped out of the way of the man who attempted to have his horse charge him down. Rolling to his feet, he grabbed a javelin off the ground and threw it at the man's back. It hit home, but didn't knock him off of his horse. However, his sudden appearance had lifted the spirits of the knights of Sirios. Rallying what strength they had left, the youngest straightened up and stabbed the injured Imperial knight in the thigh, this wound being enough to drop him from his mount. Dmitri grabbed another fallen lance off the ground and used it as a ground spike, forcing a charging horse to rear back and throw its rider into a wall. Thank you, Your Highness," the young knight said shakily. "We've broken most of our weapons, and we're running out of steam." "Retreat for now," Dmitri told them, helping one of the knights back to his feet. "Inform Lady Rhea or Lady Byleth of any new developments. Have you seen any sign of the Death Knight?" The young knight's eyes widened. "That's right, I did. He's trying to carve a path through the far right to the monastery. Some of the students are trying to hold him off." Dmitri felt his blood go cold, "but I haven't seen anything for a while." "Thank you," Dmitri said in a rush before turning around and running through one of the narrow alleyways of the courtyard. He had very little idea of where everyone was. The battlefield was constantly changing, and aside from sticking in small groups for defensive purposes, the students tended to rush off to where they were most needed. It was becoming apparent that they were perhaps the most talented soldiers on the battlefield right now. Everywhere they went, they pushed back their opponents and bailed out the knights who rushed into situations where they became overwhelmed. Fortunately, he did know where a couple of people were now. At least he could expand that now, after the Death Knight was removed from consideration. Dmitri scrambled over a pile of rubble, nearly stepping on the nearly bisected corpse of a knight. Grimacing, he stepped out into the wide-open pathway identical to the one he'd been in with Byleth and Linhard and took in the scene that he'd been warned about. It wasn't good. Just as he stepped in, he saw the Death Knight charge forward and bring his scythe down on Raphael. The big blonde managed to bring his gauntlets up and block the hit, but his arms shook under the impact, and the Death Knight leaned on it, forcing him to his knees with the tip of the blazing black blade digging into Raphael's shoulders. That's when Happy appeared from around a corner on the back of her own horse. One hand raised, she cast death at him, the malevolent spell swirling around the evil knight before digging in. Either the man had stupendous resistance, or the spell's instant death chance that gave it its name hadn't fully kicked in. Either way, he nearly slipped off the back of his horse, loosing the pressure he'd been keeping on Raphael, allowing the boy to stand up and scramble backwards. Moments later, Yuri appeared behind him and cast heal on his shoulder while the Death Knight rounded on Happy. The Death Knight raised his scythe and brought it down. A blast of magic in the shape of a blade flew out toward her. Happy's eyes widened. She managed to turn her horse enough that she didn't take the full brunt of the blast, but it still hit home, and hit hard enough to throw her off her horse, dropping her to the ground. Yuri cursed and vanished, a flicker of orange light tagging his intentions. Raphael called out Happy's name in alarm as he ran forward. Of course, the Death Knight's horse was faster, running down toward the girl. Happy struggled to get up, pressing a hand against her chest as she struggled to breathe after being winded upon impact. That's when Dmitri made his move. He grabbed a discarded javelin from the ground and ran forward a few steps, aiming and then throwing. It struck home, slamming into the Death Knight's back, digging into a chink in the armor of his left shoulder and stopping him cold just a few feet away from Happy. Stalling him long enough for Yuri to appear, wrap his arms around his friend's shoulders, pull her to her feet and grab the reins of her horse. Happy, thinking quickly through her pain, cast Banshee through gritted teeth. The blast caught the man's horse and splashed against his head, slowing him to the point where he might as well have been walking in waist-high mud. Yuri cast heal on her, clearing up her chest, and helped her back onto her horse in one smooth movement. Dmitri wasn't idle while this was happening. He was charging forward, rushing to the Death Knight who struggled to turn around and face his new opponent. In a spark of inspiration, he would have to thank Claude later, Dimitri swung his lance, aiming not at the man's body but at the reins and straps of his horse's bridle and saddle. The Death Knight had moved to guard his legs, and Dimitri liked to think he saw the man's one remaining eye widen beneath his helmet when he saw the tip of the silver lance's blade slice through his reins. His horse, alarmed by the sharp point slashing so close to its eyes, reared back onto its hind legs, not having a chance to reorient himself. The Death Knight instinctively pulled on the reins to keep himself steady. Instead, the now broken twine slipped clear of his hands and the man was pulled from his seat by gravity, toppling to the ground while his mount darted away from Dimitri. Yuri leapt out of its way to avoid getting trampled. Dimitri turned on his heel to keep the knight in his field of vision. He tried to rush forward again, but the Death Knight was ready for him now that he knew he was there. The scythe came up and knocked his lance aside, before slashing downward and carving into his leg. White pain flooded Dimitri's head. He bit the inside of his cheek in an attempt to force himself to focus through it. He attacked again, shifting his weight so there was less weight on his now badly bleeding leg. The scythe blocked again. The Death Knight pushed his feet underneath him, trying to get up as the effects of Banshee finally started to fade. With a roar of defiance, Raphael, blood pouring down his arm from the wound in his shoulder, stormed forward and slammed his gauntlet into the back of the Death Knight's head. The man jerked and nearly fell on his face, catching himself and rolling out of the way when Dimitri brought his lance down so the blade slammed into the dirt instead of his neck. The knight, Juritsá, it was Juritsá. The man had always unnerved him a bit but he wouldn't have suspected him of being this, stood up and spun around, anticipating Yuri appearing behind him for an attempted backstabbing. He brought his scythe down on Yuri, who managed to partially block it with his sword only for the curve of the blade to allow Juritsá to catch him in the back, dragging a nasty scar across his flesh as the older man pulled the weapon back. Yuri cussed in a foreign language and teleported from beneath the weapon, reappearing several feet away and casting aura without missing a beat despite the pain he was in. Dimitri felt his respect for the other boy rise once again. The spell was powerful, so although Yuri wasn't as powerful as Lysithea or Byleth, the white magic spell slammed into Juritsá with significant force. The man stumbled backwards with a grunt. His armor singed and melted in place, yet he still stood and brought the scythe up to face them. What the hell is this man made of? Dimitri wondering, blinking rapidly to center his vision. It was blurring a bit thanks to the bleeding from his legs. We have to finish this. A swirl of dark magic formed around Juritsá again, a pair of red eyes flashed, and then the spell hit home. Juritsá shouted in pain as his shoulder armor disintegrated and black patches appeared on his skin, oozing blood and a green liquid that made Dimitri's stomach turn over. Happy was leaning forward on her horse, her expression set in determination. "Nighty night," she said with a serenity that didn't match the look in her eyes, before she snapped her fingers again. Juritsá brought both his arms up to defend himself. Miasma struck true, disintegrating his arm guards and leaving him open for Raphael, who leapt at his side and unleashed a blinding flurry of punches reinforced by his silver gauntlets. The impacts knocked Juritsá to the ground, knocking his helmet off and revealing his silver-white hair which now had stains of blood and patches on it. "Everyone!" Mercedes's voice caught Dimitri's ear as he prepared to try and finish the monster off. He glanced up to see her rushing through the alleyway he himself had emerged from. She'd lost her hair tie at some point. In fact, it looked like someone had cut her hair with a sword. There was some blood on her collar, the long locks of her silver hair falling around her shoulders and face like a curtain. Wait a moment. His mind must have been foggy thanks to the blood loss. As the Death Knight helmet split in half from the abuse it had taken over the past few hours and fell apart, Juritsá's face was exposed for all of them to see. The man turned his head and saw Mercedes with a pair of blue eyes, which was strange because weren't his eyes blood red even before he revealed himself as the Death Knight that slowly widened as he focused on her. He seemed to forget all about the other students surrounding him. He reached out in her direction, mouthing out Mercedes. Suddenly, this terrible killer looked more like a lost child desperately seeking solace or salvation. Mercedes's mouth fell open a bit in shock. Her eyes latched onto him and his face, after frantically bouncing all over her friends to take tabs on their injuries. "Emile?" she asked weakly, somehow audible above the chaos. Even amidst her obvious shock, her hands were pressed together and a ball of healing magic blipped into existence over them. "Fortify." Mercedes, the strange echo/distortion that characterized the Death Knight's voice suddenly disappeared. Mercedes then raised her hands and cast Fortify. Dmitri let out a gasp of relief as the pain in his leg melted away and his head stopped spinning from blood loss. Raphael rolled his shoulder in relief, and Yuri darted forward in hopes of finishing Jaritsa off. But wasn't quite fast enough to prevent the Death Knight from suddenly giving up the fight and teleporting away. Rewarp, Atra had called the spell. Dmitri cursed whomever had invented the spell and sent a silent prayer to Suthies that he wouldn't be able to rejoin the battle. Kiri Mercy, what was that? Happy asked, her horse trotting over to the healer's side. Nice save, by the way, I'm very grateful, but do you know that guy? It was hard to tell thanks to the soot on her face and the fact that the sun was dipping toward the horizon on the far side of her face, but Dmitri thought that Mercedes looked quite pale. I thought I recognized him for a moment, but is it really possible? She wondered, speaking as much to herself as Happy. Why do they have the same face? Dmitri wondered. I dunno, but maybe we can worry about that later. Happy suggested, offering Mercedes her hand. The front half of the monastery courtyard is basically secure, but that broken golem isn't going to keep out the Empire forever. We should go down and rejoin the others. As if to punctuate her words, there was a massive flash of golden light further down the courtyard, joined by a crack of thunder and the sound of stone shattering. Byleth was back in the fight, and Dmitri needed to be where she was. Where Claude would be, if the skies were finally under their control. The prince glanced upward. There were far less Pegasi the skies now, once they were able to wholly focus on them instead of having to aim carefully throughout the grounds. The ballistas provided excellent support to the church's flyers. Briefly he saw a white wyvern fly down toward the front. All right, Mercedes said, with the air of someone forcing herself to refocus. She accepted Happy's offer and was pulled up onto the back of her horse. Yuri walked over to Raphael, one eyebrow raised. How you doing, big guy? He asked casually. I'm good to go, the blonde promised. He was taking deep, slow breaths, running one hand through his sweat-soaked bangs to push them away from his eyes. I'm just, kinda tired. Mercedes just gave me a pick-me-up. Yeah, well it's not just you. Yuri assured him, wryly pressing a few fingers against his chest. Unfortunately we can't sit down just yet. Hurry up, slowpokes. We'll be needed. Happy said chidingly before clicking her heels against her horse's flanks. Nickering, the stallion shot ahead, carrying the two girls toward the front lines. Expelling a long breath and pressing his foot against the ground, putting extra weight on it just to make sure that his balance was fully restored, Dmitri started to walk forward too. He grabbed the blood-stained javelin off the ground and retrieved a few arrows that were scattered over the grass to refill his dwindling quiver. How are you holding up, Your Highness? Yuri appeared on his right, startling him and nearly causing him to go for his lance. The blonde gave the trickster a disapproving look, to which his friend apologetically raised his hands. I'm sorry, but you can forgive me for being worried, right? Dmitri shut his eyes for a second before opening them again and starting to jog down the long pathway toward the front lines, Yuri and Raphael at his side. There was more rubble and increasingly more corpses as they made their way forward. Knights lay dead and scattered, many bodies trampled. Imperial corpses were stacked in piles in front of what had once been makeshift fortifications. No matter where you looked, it was almost impossible to get away from them. Once they got clear of most of the buildings into the yard that had once been the road of commerce, Dmitri could clearly see the walls and a bit beyond. The fires that had been raging out of control for hours now had dampened down significantly. Claude and Constance had bought them precious time, and it was impossible to tell from where he stood how much damage the wildfires had done to the army outside the gates, but they were far from done. He could still hear shouting and jeers outside the walls. He could hear people calling that witch's name. Calling for her to break through and lead them to victory. He snarled low in his throat and pushed onward, having long since gone numb to the smell of smoke and the dead. He passed by Flane, who was standing and praying in the middle of a massive circle of injured people, including Marianne, Ash, Sylvain, and Leonie, he noted with a violent jolt of concern. The redhead had a black eye and was bleeding badly from a head wound. Leonie had blood covering her arm which was wrapped in a hasty makeshift sling. Marianne had worrying torn sleeves, Blood splashed on her face in a distressed expression. Ash was trading away his broken bow for a replacement, Soot, and Ash turning his silver hair black and his gloves having holes torn in them. Moments later, Flame spread her hands and Fortify spread across all of the people around her, the crest of Cethlean glowing above her head. All those wounds healed before Dimitri's eyes. He marveled at the sight and listened to the ragged cheers of relief from those who'd stumbled close to death's door. She's like the saint reborn. How long has she been here, in the thick of it, healing without rest? Judging by the blood splattered across her robes and the various small bandages she was wearing, it had been a long time. But there was nothing but resolution in the kind girl's face. She waved her hands over her head, calling for more wounded while a relieved Leonie unbound her arm, bending it slowly and tentatively just to be safe. Dimitri. The blonde had never been so happy to hear Sylvain's voice. His childhood friend hurried over, clutching the reins of his horse. When he stopped, he scrubbed furiously at his face to rub the blood from his eyes. Man, am I glad to see you. Where's everyone else? Glad to see you too, Dimitri said in relief, taking a moment to wrap an arm around Sylvain's shoulder and pull him into a quick but tight hug. Speaking for the Blue Lions, Didu, Felix, and Glenn were somewhere behind me a few minutes ago. Ingrid is up in the air. Annette is still manning one of the ballistas. We're here now. Annette's voice interrupted him. The students all turned around to find Bernadetta riding toward them with Annette perched on horseback behind her. Felix, Glenn, and Didu were following closely behind. Glenn trotted to a stop, grabbing Sylvain in a one-armed hug and quickly scanning him for injuries before looking up at the sky. Byleth told us to go ahead before she went charging off to try and make sure the makeshift gate holds just a little longer. She's terrifyingly powerful now, Bernadetta said in equal parts reverence and fear. This is what absorbing Suthisa's heart did to her? Does this mean the professor is a goddess now? For the life of him, Dimitri didn't have an answer to that. Even his knee-jerk reaction, born of being raised the heir of the Holy Kingdom, was utterly muted. She's still Teach, no matter what. She hasn't changed a bit otherwise. A wonderfully familiar, if very tired-sounding, voice echoed from behind them. Dimitri spun around, his eyes settling on Claude's face. His star was covered in blood splatters all over his clothes, grime and sweat slicking his hair to his head, and unless his eyes were deceiving him, his hands were trembling a bit. Ivory nudged her rider lightly with her nose, looking a little ragged herself. There were burn scars and soot on her sides and on one of her wings. Approaching from behind him were a dizzy-looking Lysithea, who was leaning on her Pegasus while accepting a pure water booster from Constance, while Ingrid picked her way across the dirt toward him and Glenn, worry in her eyes still somehow predominant over the exhaustion in her eyes. Claude swiped at his eyes and called tiredly, "Mercedes, might we benefit from your brilliant magic for a moment?" "I'm coming," Mercedes promised, darting forward as magic swirled around her hands. Dimitri noted distractedly that she was starting to look a little pale in the face, which wasn't a good sign. "I'm here for you," she raised her hands and cast over the 4 flyers and their mounts, healing any lingering injuries inflicted on both human and beast. Ivory chirped in delight as the magic sank into her scales, shaking like a dog that had just stepped out of a river. Dimitri, who'd been all but vibrating on the spot since he and Claude had locked eyes, waited just long enough for the magic to run its course before lunging forward and wrapping his arms around his star to embrace him tightly. Claude returned the gesture with only half a second of hesitation, regardless of the fact that they were surrounded by their friends. If that didn't accentuate the dire nature of this situation, nothing would. "Are you okay?" Dimitri asked, his voice cracking. He pulled back just enough to stare in dismay at the sheer amount of blood staining Claude's clothes. The hidden prince had the nerve to smile at him. "It looks a lot worse than it is," he said lightly. "Major Crest of Regan, remember?" They drew as much strength from the embrace as they could in a few seconds before parting. Claude looked down at his leg and frowned. "What the hell happened to your leg?" "The Death Knight," Yuri deadpanned, looking between them with an alarmingly knowing expression on his face. "He also happened to my back, incidentally. Lucky for us, Mercedes decided to come and check on us." Sylvain neglected to remark on that in favor of staring at Dimitri, his eyes occasionally flickering over to Claude. Something seemed to click in his head and his mouth dropped open. Fortunately, the brunette noticed this, caught the other boy's attention, and very sincerely mouthed out "Don't you dare" with a glacially calm expression on his face. Sylvain nodded dumbly, making absolutely no effort to close his mouth as he went back to staring at Dimitri. "Hey!" Balthus called out, rushing over to their side with Hilda and belatedly Ignatz at his heels. "Wow, you guys look awful." "No, you're just way too cheerful," Claude grumbled good-naturedly. Lysithea muttered something under her breath and started to remount her Pegasus, which was stomping its hooves in worry. "How are you not exhausted?" "Because I divided my time between holding a defensive position and forging on ahead," Balthus offered, looking sincerely bemused. "Oh, screw you, I'm a cavalry bow wielder. I'm supposed to charge on ahead, or backward, or wherever I'm needed at top speed," Leonie grumbled, accepting a handful of replacement arrows for her quiver from a knight who'd come up to her. She then handed off a broken lance and a broken javelin off to him, looking disgruntled. "What's the situation out front?" Annette asked anxiously, rubbing her hands together. There were noticeable burn scars on her hands, a consequence of manning a magic ballista for hours, no doubt. She didn't look pained, however, so she must have been mostly healed. "Are we holding?" "For now," Sylvain said. He looked solemn. "The problem is that doesn't mean much with how big the damned army out there is. We've been fighting tooth and nail, and Ada, the Emperor still has who knows how many troops to throw at us." "Didn't the fires do something about that?" Ash protested, looking pale. "No, it did," Claude responded seriously. "The Emperor lost a good number of people, and far more importantly equipment, in the blazes. Many of the soldiers survived, but their supply trains didn't. That means they can't afford to sit outside, sending the occasional wave of men at us while starving us out. Hell, she has to put serious consideration into how her men are meant to get back over the Ogma Mountains with the supplies that survived." He grimaced. "Though knowing that Edelgard prefers to claim victory at any cost, it might not be the morale breaker I was hoping for." Edelgard, will fight to take the monastery unless there's a significant sign that it's not possible," Dorothea lamented. The beautiful songstress, covered in grunge, blood, and soot, looked like she had spent some time crying. Linhard walked up behind her and placed an awkward hand on her shoulder. "She thinks she must, or else the lives sacrificed to claim it would be rendered meaningless." Something cold and unpleasant crawled up Dimitri's spine. "That sounds familiar," one of his ghosts muttered dryly. He furiously shook his head to drive them away. "That wasn't true." "We don't have a huge amount of daylight left," Lysithea noted, looking up at the sky. It wasn't quite sunset, but the evening was marching onward. Would the Empire stop when the last light of day dies, or would they simply light torches and keep going? "It's hard to tell," Claude muttered. "The Imperials have to rest some time, they're still human. But the Emperor still has the luxury of switching in lines of fresh-faced soldiers who haven't seen combat yet, to say nothing of the non-human elements of the army. We can't do that, the Church simply didn't have enough allies within arm's reach." "We're tired," Marianne said quietly. Dimitri knew a prognosis when he heard one, and knew he wasn't the only one grimacing at the admission. "All of us. Our professor is still going strong, but she's still mortal, so she'll get tired eventually. Perhaps that's what the Emperor is aiming for? Waiting for us to fight until we're too weak to stand. If that's true, we need to change the terms of the battlefield," Yuri said adamantly. He didn't have to glance back over his shoulder for Dimitri to know that he was fearing for his people, fled into the woods of the sealed forest. "I'd volunteer to cut off the beast's head, but I'm not sure I can get to her, even with my crest and my relic. To get into the middle of that army and then get out, that's a dicey proposition." "You'd need a distraction, and something tough enough to cut through her armor," Claude acknowledged, his brow furrowed. "She does prefer to fight on the front lines. Honestly, I'm surprised she hasn't come out on the offensive yet." There was another great explosion of golden light, the sound of demonic beasts screaming in denial of reality until they disintegrated under the goddess's granted power, and a ragged cheer going up from the defenders still standing at the front lines. "That sounds like a few more minutes being bought for us to strategize," Yuri said thoughtfully. Then he made a face. "Can anyone find me an armor slayer? There's got to be one out here somewhere." "Never mind that," Bernadetta said, bringing her horse over to him. She fumbled with something at her waist and pulled one of her two swords, sheath and all, from her belt buckle and handed it down to him. This will be lighter, and serve the same purpose, if you can get close enough to her. Yuri blinked twice and unsheathed the blade. The blood-stained blade of a rapier glistened in the late evening sunlight. He smiled wryly up at her. You're okay going without this? I'll manage. I still have one. Bernadetta patted the hilt of her specialized killing edge. No, this style of blade was called a wodu, right? Plus my bow. But if you're going to fight, her expression twisted with pain for a moment, before soldiering onward, take out Edelgard, you'll need it. We defeated one of the army's generals a while ago, Felix mused. He should have made it back to his master with his tail between his legs by now. Will she come to us now, or will she just throw more underlings at us? Where's Atra? Constance asked in puzzlement, looking around the group. She's sticking close to Teach, Claude responded. In order to guard her from the Agarthans unquestionably in this strike force. He grimaced, brow furrowing in frustration. I've seen, maybe a handful of enemies I think were from that city. Not nearly as many as I expected. My best guess is that she's holding them back, but who for if not Teach? She's been single-handedly holding various lines for hours now. From what I've seen, the Emperor is more on the pragmatic side. Yuri mused. She's holding them back for someone she doesn't think she can defeat without them otherwise. As to who that could be. He frowned. Maybe it is the professor, but she wants to lure her out of the monastery? The legends talk about how Nemesis lead from the front, smashing through entire armies like a living avalanche. Perhaps she assumes that now that Byleth is essentially the king reborn, she'll take on a similar tact. That's a big assumption to waste waves of troops on. Claude noted, though Dmitri could see that he was considering the idea. Of course she'd do it. She doesn't value human lives at all, only her vision, his father said scathingly. Is Byleth strong enough to fight the troops outside the walls, if she is willing to act as Yuri's distraction? Ash asked hesitantly. We'd be able to provide her a little support, and if it brings Edelgard closer. The rest of his question was cut off by war horns. Very familiar war horns. Dmitri felt his heart jump up in his chest. Spinning around, ignoring the gasps rising from everyone around him, he ran to the nearest two-story house and began to climb the crumbling wall. He cut his hand on glass but barely noticed. He made his way up to the top and scrambled up on top of the battered but still solid rooftop and stood up straight. It was enough to see over the walls, and the sun illuminated the grasslands ahead of him. The sight brought tears to the edges of his eyes. The war horns of Faerghus blew again, waves of blue and silver-clad troops emerging from over the horizon under the banners of Frildarius, Gautier, and the royal crest. There were Pegasus knights in the air, lines of cavalry and infantry marching in step toward the heart of their faith and the place where their heirs were trapped in a desperate battle. Before he could even really, truly take this in, a horn of a different land in a different tone rang out from far behind the giant mass of Empire troops. Dmitri felt the disbelieving smile split his face as the golden banner of the Alliance emerged from the forest, followed by a massive horde of soldiers marching in several different blocks. One, the leaders, held the standard of House Goneril. Marching side by side with them was a group with the symbol of House Regan on all of their flags. Behind them were the signs of Gloucester and Edmund, and Daphnel as well. And as they emerged from the forest, they split off, a group bearing each banner at their head taking off to the right and tearing across the grass that was now bathed in golden orange-red light. As Dmitri watched, they approached the front of the kingdom troops, one holding something over his head. Moments later, they slowed and met with a couple of soldiers who had stepped out of the Frildarius ranks. If Edelgard knew and understood what this meant, well, all the ghosts lingering around him were laughing raucously and wishing they could see her face. Their reinforcements had arrived. Chapter 50. Khalid knew he was grinning uncontrollably, but he couldn't help it. Besides, everyone else was cheering at the top of their lungs, so none of them had the right to judge him anyway. Hey Hannah! He called out to the Pegasus princess. She immediately trotted over on the back of her Pegasus and raised one eyebrow. Find Seath, then Lady Rhea, and tell them the good news. She can afford to send Catherine and Shamir down now to lend a hand. Everyone, let's go reinforce the breach area. We wouldn't want to let anyone else through now. Hannah nodded, smiling at him, and took off amidst the roaring of renewed spirit and determination from seemingly every area of the courtyard. Khalid patted Ivory's neck and then swung up onto her back again, sliding a freshly refilled quiver onto his back. There was one final horn blast from outside the monastery, 2 horns of 2 different kingdoms blaring out in unison. Then the thunder of hundreds of horses and the wing beats of pixie and wyvern alike, such a familiar sound from his days growing up, echoed across the fields like the thunder of a massive avalanche. Their families and their people come to their rescue. Don't let your guard down. He made sure to yell over the noise. The Empire will fight harder than ever now that they're the ones fighting a losing battle. Rally to Byleth. Rally to the one chosen by Suthies. He almost didn't say the second sentence, but the way all of the knights around them, even those who had become exhausted, despondent, and were close to giving up, all surged to their feet and began rushing down the main road toward the entrance where Byleth and Atra were fighting. Gramps would be proud, he thought bemusedly. I really hope I haven't pissed her off, reinforcing their divine vision of her. Oh, who am I kidding? I'm sleeping on the floor for a week and I know it. Somehow that didn't feel quite as disheartening as it would have otherwise. It means we still have that week ahead of us, after all. Urging Ivory off the ground, he flew in a quick circle over to the roof Dimitri was standing on and offered him a hand, still grinning. His prince had tears in his eyes. He couldn't have that, could he? You want to stay here and admire the scenery? Or do you still have enough energy to help? He asked as teasingly as he could manage over the lump in his throat. Honestly, he hadn't expected the reinforcements to arrive so soon. He'd braced himself to the likelihood of having to stave off days, even possibly weeks under a brutal siege before any relief force reached them. Gramps. Dimitri laughed weakly. Only you could make jokes at a time like this. Glancing down nervously for only a moment, he accepted Claude's hand and after a second jumped off the rafters and into the brunette's waiting arms. Wincing a bit, Khalid swung him onto the saddle in front of him and wrapped one arm around his waist. This was slightly more precarious given that he needed both his hands to use his bow. Can't take him very far, then. Just up to the front. Hang on, Claude warned him airily before whistling to Ivory. She shot forward like an arrow, Dimitri flinching and pressing back against his chest at the force of the wind. They shot across the grounds, outpacing the wave of knights and even the others as they ran forward to reach Byleth. The devastation at the front of the courtyard, there at the mouth of the entrance, it was harsh. Even compared to the rest of the area. Corpses were stacked in literal bonfire piles, the stench of death was overwhelming, heavy enough to make Khalid's stomach try to stage a revolt. Ballista bolts were embedded in the ground and in the buildings, great piles of ash and bone left behind by demonic beasts after they disintegrated lay in heaps seemingly within every 20 feet. The ruined golem that had bought them that precious hour of defense had been split in half and blown away, leaving the wide opening into the monastery, that none of the Imperials were taking advantage of, with a massive trench having been carved into the earth out for over a dozen yards. Standing in the mouth of the exit, staring in awe out at the field, was a bloody and soot-covered Atra who was still wrenching her sword out of an extremely pale corpse. Next to her, the late evening light making her hair gleam like liquid jewels in spite of the bloodstains covering her, was Byleth, sword of the Creator in hand. Both girls spun around when Ivory trilled excitedly. Byleth, her eyes carrying heavy shadows, nevertheless tilted her head up and beamed when Claude brought his partner down next to her. Dimitri slid off the wyvern and immediately cradled Byleth's face in his hands. Are you hurt? He asked worriedly. Do you need to rest? Byleth shook her head while Atra watched with a very faint smile. No, I can make it. With the kingdom and the alliance, we can win this, but we have to get out there. Wait, you want to what? Khalid repeated, leaning forward a bit just to make sure he hadn't misunderstood her. No, she's right. Felix interrupted. Khalid glanced back and raised an eyebrow at the sight of the grumpy swordsman sitting behind Bernadetta on the back of her horse. The Empire can draw with the combined forces of our home, but if you can hit their flanks with our support, they'll break. Byleth looked up at Claude, a mixture of sadness and determination in her eyes. We're no use to them staying in here, she said simply. Edelgard has no choice but to turn her army to face the kingdom and the alliance, or else they'll smash through her lines. At best, she can leave Hubert and a few battalions to annoy us, nothing our relics couldn't contend with. She shook her head. But that doesn't account for the Agarthan assistance she's been holding back. Whether that's more demonic beasts or a spell similar to the one Solon intended to use on me before Yuri cut him off. The violet-eyed teen smirked a bit at the description. And our allies aren't fully prepared for it. We haven't really been able to elaborate in letters, after all. Khalid rolled that thought over in his mind, and nodded after a moment. The words made perfect sense. Now, how could he make it work? He had to think quickly, too. Their allies were already charging towards the Empire. What do we have on our hands to make a smoke screen? He called, throwing his voice so the knights around him, including an approaching Cyril, Catherine, and Shamir. That was weird. Why had they left Ria's side? Where is Ria right now? Can all hear him? It doesn't have to last long. It's best if it only lasts a minute or two. It just has to be big and flashy. Quickly, people, quickly. Half a dozen knights instantly scramble to obey him. After hours of battle, this no longer makes his head spin. Instead he shoves the tiny voice that sounds like a 10-year-old him squeaking and freaking out into a box in the back of his mind and points out through the door. Load it up on the nearest ballista and aim for above and in front of the Empire lines facing us as best you can. Knights, form up behind Catherine and Shamir. Lions, deer, form up battalions around Sylvain and Hilda. You two, relics up, you're leading the charge behind Teach and I. Lysithea. The white-haired girl had prepared to take off, only to stop when Lawrence called her name. Turning in surprise, she gaped when he offered her a long, twisted staff that glowed with gold except for the red stone embedded in it. Claude blinked. He hadn't recalled Lawrence bragging that his father had entrusted him with the family relic. When did that happen? And was even more surprised when the purple-haired noble solemnly said, "From the sky, you can make better use of it than me right now." There was something in his expression, and something that flickered across Lysithea's face, that suggested they'd had a significant conversation that Claude had not been privy to. But it was gone in a blink. Lysithea really was good at pushing her emotions down when she wanted to. Why was that? Lysithea nodding solemnly and quietly said thanks Lawrence. Atra stepped over to Bylith's side. His Teach glanced at her and asked, "Are you sure you don't want to stay back with the others? The kickback from the sword is pretty intense. I promised I'd protect you, my best hope for Agartha's defeat, and the person who took me in despite knowing what I've done." Atra responded, shaking her head. She stuck one sword in the ground just long enough to tighten the ponytail that had been threatening to come loose. "You're not going in to fight that army without me at your back." That fearless declaration of protection got a cheer and number of backpats from the knights who were on their way to fall in line. Atra, as ever, looked dumbfounded by the positive reinforcement. "Ballistas are loaded, Lord Regan," one of the knights yelled. Claude looked around in confusion for a second before realizing that, given there was no way his over 70-year-old grandfather was either on this battlefield or close enough to be shouted at, he was Lord Regan. For a moment, he indulged in a sinking feeling comparable to the inexorable pull of gravity before pointedly banishing it. Through the wall, he could see the banners of his mother's family crash into the lines of the Empire, leading from the front, just as they had when his ancestor succeeded from the kingdom. He set his jaw and allowed himself once glance over his shoulder at Dimitri, standing side by side with Sylvain, before looking forward and snapping fire. Two different ballistas crack as they fire their newest payload. Khalid hit his heels against Ivory's side as hard as he could and shouted forward, while sending a silent prayer to Suthies and Ash both that he hadn't just made a mistake. He hadn't prayed for anything in a long, long time, because when had they ever answered him, but Suthies cared enough to embrace him and to give her heart to Teach so they could win, so maybe just this once. Ivory shot up and over the main gate before his fears have a chance to raise their voices. She's flying fast enough that they're in the air and yards away from the main gate when he sees the impromptu smoke screen detonate, covering the line of mages that had been facing them and a huge number of the men behind them too. His chest loosens the tiniest bit, because that worked better than he had hoped to. Poisons thrown together in a handful of seconds don't have a good track record in his experience. Maybe that was the last of their luck. Now they had to make it the rest of the way on guts, glory, and determination. Father is going to sulk over missing this. Meanwhile, if this doesn't kill me, Mom just might. Khalid urged Ivory up, had her follow after Maia and Lysithea as the black bolt flew high up and up, just out of ballista range. Normally, this would render it fairly impossible to hit anything, but Lawrence had given her his hero's relic. The Thyrsus staff wasn't as flashy as the weapon relics, a novice knight might call it less useful by comparison. However, anyone who had ever relied on a sniper would be glad to tell them how wrong they were. Thyrsus shared a commonality with Failnaught in that it allowed the wielder to see far further than human eyes would allow. Stories abounded about Gloucester heirs picking off enemy lords from a mountaintop miles away from what might have been the battlefield, or the Regan lords sniping through snowstorms so thick you struggled to see your hand right in front of your face. The other perk was boosted power, which Lysithea already had in abundance. "Now, where are those demonic beasts?" the white-haired girl growled. Claude was about to say something when the answer presented itself. Pools of purple and black light bloomed within the ranks behind the battalions now locked in frantic conflict with the kingdom and the empire. "Someone's spooked," he mused. "But who? And how can I pressure them more? Constance, be a dear and lend Lysithea a hand, will you?" "As you wish," Constance responded, one hand raised. Lysithea smirked and pointed Thyrsus downward. Bolting and Seraphim blasted straight down like twin pillars of divine retribution, surgically smashing into the dark pools below where the demonic beasts were forming. Khalid flew in a circle around them as the two women flew a few feet away from their previous positions and fired again. He dropped a few dozen feet below them, grabbed a heavy chunk of stone from the saddlebag hanging around Ivory's shoulders and dropped it, aiming for a caravan directly below him. The stone wasn't too large, but it was heavy, and the speed with which it fell would make up for the lack of sides and spades. "Not nearly as flashy by comparison, but it helps me contribute." As Lysithea rained down another Seraphim, Khalid glanced back, looking for Byleth. The smoke screen had come in clutch. He found her just moments before a massive and now familiar blaze of golden light tore through that grey haze and into the ground a mere yard from the Imperial army. His gaze was slightly skewed by the height and angle he was looking from, but he was sure the shockwave literally picked up the entire front line facing the ragtag defenders of the monastery and blew them away like a hurricane wind. Rocks and dislodged earth sprayed everywhere, crashing into ballistics and train cars alike. Twin blazes of white gold light lit up at the front of both columns following Byleth as Sylvain and Hilda crashed into the now disoriented rear guard at Byleth's heels. "May my foes someday forgive me," Constance murmured, as much to herself as anyone else, her voice almost inaudible among the wind and the chaos below. Then she snapped her fingers, her crest blazing and unleashing another bolting down upon the demonic beasts alone. The smoke that had been semi-hiding them had dissipated under the assault. Not far north of them, the Gaelta Pegasus divisions were engaging a large chunk of the remaining Imperial Air Force. He could also see both the Gautier and Gloucester cavalry charges bursting through the lines in a vicious-looking pincer attack, while Daphnal forces, was Judith down there? Seemed to be pulling the hit-and-run tactics that famed hero had used against the Almiran incursion years ago. The Faerghus Crown forces seemed to be trying to create an opening in the middle of the Imperial army, albeit with slow success. The Regan troops seemed to be moving to assist them directly. The Ordelia mages were standing behind allied lines, raining fire and lightning down from a safe distance. "You're being hammered from all sides, Edelgard. Whatever your secret weapon is, you can't afford to keep holding it back. Where is it?" Khalid heard the neighs of the flying battalion approaching them before he saw them, drawing two arrows and urging Ivory towards the sound. "Keep it up, watch out for any signs of Agartha and magic," he warned his flying artillery. "I'll keep you covered." When their newest enemy came into focus, he was flanked by Hannah on his right and Seath on his left. "You mean we'll keep them covered?" the older bishop said solemnly. Khalid favored him with a smile before quickly refocusing. It was a smaller than usual battalion, probably a sign that they'd been assembled and sent skyward in a hurry. Nevertheless, it was a wyvern platoon, so it wasn't as though they weren't taking him seriously. Especially considering the woman leading the charge. She was decked out in very ornate armor, her chest plate glittering with medals, and she gave him a look of fanatical scorn. "My life was changed forever by Her Majesty," she proclaimed, pointing her axe directly at him. Not at Seath, Rhea's right-hand man, not Hannah, an old member of a storied and feared mercenary group. She was absolutely focused on him. "Now, I lay it on the line. For the Empire." Khalid didn't dignify that with a verbal response, as tempting as it was. Instead he just felt significant unease, not that he had time to dwell on it. He pulled on Ivory's reins and had her shoot straight up, neatly avoiding the woman's charge and turning to fire down at her. The other knights behind her had surged forward. Seath impaled one on the spear of Asul and threw a hand axe at another's back, hitting her right between the shoulders despite the speed at which she'd been flying. She dropped from her mount while Hannah flew up over her Pegasus, throwing a javelin that impaled another who had designs on Lysithea, who was still raining hell down on the various demonic beasts below, pounding them into dust and ash. Khalid fired his first volley at the general. She dodged, which was annoying but not unexpected. She pulled a very sharp bank and flew straight at them. Ivory folded her wings and dropped, freefall, for half a dozen yards before snapping them out again, beginning an aileron roll. Claude grabbed 2 more arrows and, in the seconds that he spent upside down, fired up at the wyvern above him, right at the vulnerable stomach. A screech suggested he hit. He couldn't really see as Ivory righted the 2 of them again and the blood had to rush back out of his head again, and he quickly drew again, turning Ivory on the spot. "There can be little hope of victory unless you are defeated," the woman shouted as she angled her mount down toward him. "So be it, Regan. You still think you can win?" Claude asked incredulously, leaning forward as Ivory dodged her enemy again. The winds whipped against his face from how close the woman had gotten to him. He could see the flash of silver glancing off her axe. "Have you looked down recently? Her Majesty is the hope for Fodlan's future. She will succeed, it is inevitable." The woman retorted furiously. She banked hard to avoid another hail of arrows from him. "You've got to be kidding me, were they still not going to break, even with Teach pushing into the back lines and the Kingdom and Alliance catching them in a terrible pincer attack? They weren't prepared for this kind of fight, only a siege, even with the sheer number of demonic beasts spawning. How did she still think Edelgard could win this fight? I have to take Edelgard out of the fight, somehow. If they can maintain morale as long as she's leading the charge." Khalid grimaced as he drew and fired again. "Which means I'm gonna have to find her in that sea of enemies down there. Ash, bind my will to yours." Ivory snarled, tossing her head back. Khalid grinned, understanding immediately. "Let's go, girl." With Seath's shout from behind him ringing in his ears, "You shall not survive," as he took out whoever had tried to sneak up on him, he let his white mount launch herself directly at the woman's wyvern. Ivory flew with the speed of a ballistic missile, putting all her muscles into it, and swung back so all 4 of her legs were aimed at the enemy's neck and chest, claws bared. Claude didn't get a chance to see the woman general's expression when they slammed into her and her mount, but he didn't doubt she would have cursed him out if she hadn't nearly been thrown from her saddle by the impact. Ivory sank her claws into and through the leather and iron armor protecting the wyvern's neck and chest, tearing at his scales and into the soft flesh below. Not wanting to make her do all the work, Claude twisted his body so he was aiming his brave bow just over Ivory's shoulder at the wing joint of their opponent, gritted his teeth and fired. The 2 arrows struck true. Ivory let out a howl of triumph before flinging her bleeding and beaten opponent below her. Khalid grinned dizzily through his vertigo as he watched the general fall for yards, her wyvern jerkily catching himself and managing to slow their descent every dozen or so yards. He couldn't keep flying and carrying her, not with his wing injured like that, so he was making his way to the ground. "I can't afford to die, not here, not now. I have to fight for Byleth, for Dimitri, for my friends and for Fodlan." Realizing that he sounded a lot like the Claude who starred in his mother's favorite fable, he might be a little resigned to it at that point. "Some heartless schemer I ended up making, huh?" Then he directed Ivory upward, catching another enemy Pegasus knight in his crosshairs and firing. She fell with a scream. A distant part of his brain wondered how many people he had killed today. A sick feeling pooled in his stomach when no number would present itself in his mind. "I know I have no choice, but... what's going on down there, Lysithea? Constance!" he yelled, pulling up level with them. "We're thinning out the demonic beasts." The white-haired girl cheered, waving Thyrsus over her head. "I might actually refrain from making fun of Lawrence's attempts at finding a bride if he lets me borrow this again. Our professor has made the flank collapse inward," Constance added. "Perhaps she has forced Vestra to retreat, though obviously I cannot say that for certain from this height." "We're doing it. We're actually doing it." That's when he saw the massive disk of dark light. The magic Claude saw in that moment almost defied description. Which meant it was almost certainly Agarthan made, and certainly aimed at Teach, at Byleth. It looked like a massive black scar in the sky, a scar that was bleeding black blood tendrils, spooling out of it like many, many strings. The black magic was threaded with a sickly-looking purple thread, and he could have sworn that there was a strong current of wind going into the scar. As he watched from his vantage point, he saw stone, bodies, and wheels being pulled into it, wrapped up in the black-purple tendrils. There was a flash of gold moments later, a golden-orange blade slashing across the length of the opening. The giant scar flickered. If it looked big from where he was standing, how big was it down there? But maintained despite the hit from the fully awakened sword of the creator. Fuck. There it was, there was the other one of Edelgard's trump cards, if not the trump card that made her confident enough to invade the monastery despite knowing Teach would stand opposed to her. The Agarthan support. It had to come out at some point, but why now, why when he was so far away? Is that Dash? Lysithea started, before she cut herself off and swore. We've got to get there, Dash. Before Khalid could agree, or simply fly in that direction without saying a word, an earth-shaking roar seemed to shake the entire world. He looked over his shoulder, saw the source, and damn near fell right out of his saddle. Look at this picture, Teach. I found it buried away somewhere. This big beast is called the Immaculate One. All the stories say that the goddess sent it to aid Sirios in her crusade against Nemesis. Ring any bells? Yeesh, still no dice Suthies, that must be pretty annoying. You couldn't compare a sketch to reality. Claude always knew that, but maybe months of watching Ignat's sketch and seeing the remarkably lifelike images even the most abstract of his work invoked had distracted him a bit from that truth. Because neither words nor drawings could capture the majesty of a massive, white-scaled, honest-to-heavens dragon hurtling towards the battlefield like a missile. For a solid minute, his brain rejected the reality of it. Clearly he was feeling the effects of flying upside down one too many times over the many, many hours this siege had dragged on. But as the Immaculate One flew underneath him and his equally gobsmacked friends, and enemies, what few were left, came to a hovering pause over where the golden flashes of the relics informed him the rest of his friends were, and then unleashed fiery hell. No metaphor there. The dragon breathed what looked like a concentrated beam of the flames of Aelel directly at the massive spell. It slammed into the spell with a tangible force, the ground beneath it catching fire all over again and what sounded like the air itself cracking under the weight of this power. It wasn't a brief attack, oh no. It was long and protracted. He watched, knowing that his mouth was open but not really able to care, as the massive scar buckled, shuddered, and slowly disintegrated as the white red-orange light overwhelmed it, and then burned a long, smoking crater through the earth behind it. The dragon roared with a great and terrible rage. It flew in a large circle around the Imperial army, another beam of light building up in its throat. And that seemed to be the final straw. Under the pressure from the Kingdom and the Alliance, under the counter-attack led by Byleth, under the loss of many of their demonic beasts to the relics and the Ariel assault, and under the attack of this sudden, terrifying new player, the Imperial army broke. And they ran. They fled as the Immaculate One blasted the ground with that intense beam of fire again. They fled through the open ground away from the three lines of their tormentors. A chorus of rising cheers erupted from every allied direction. Khalid felt his head spin and quickly gave chase, babbling something over his shoulder that he didn't really hear. He could see flickers of golden light below, much less consistent than before, and used them as a guiding light back to the rest of his classmates as they chased after their would-be conquerors. That's when the last Agarthan trump card began to play. Atrag called it rewarp, the ability to move yourself instead of someone else large distances with magic. Massive circles of that light appeared sporadically throughout the much reduced, but still considerable size of the Imperial army and then flickered out, leaving gaps in the retreating force like someone had taken a bowl and scooped them out of a pond. Then the circles reappeared elsewhere, creating more circles as the Immaculate One continued its burning assault. For all its intense power, Khalid couldn't tell if it was killing more people than were disappearing every moment and reappearing much further down the fields. And then disappearing again. They set up warp stations? That was a battle theory, an untested idea. He scowled. Specifically, it was my battle theory. I wrote it up as an assignment for Teach. I'm betting Hubert stole it. Dick. Yup, his brain was still fried. He could tell because he was thinking about inane shit in the face of an actual living goddamn dragon. What in the eternal flames? Claude. Lysithia's voice snapped him out of his spiral toward a fit of insanity. Should we land? Why yeah, maybe that's a good plan, he managed. I think our role in aerial support has just been usurped. Yeah, I noticed, O Lord and Master of the understatement. The white-haired girl shrieked back. What is that? I think it's a dragon. Claude responded, marveling at the fact that those words were an actual fact and not a joke he was making. What the fuck is happening to the world? No shit, it's a dragon. I don't, how? Why? How? You're asking that like I know. Why do you think I know? Because you always know. Since when? Was Dimitri having a conversation this interesting? Yeah, he needed to go find out. Just make sure he wasn't the only one seeing this. Maybe group hallucinations were a thing, but surely he would have noticed if he inhaled that much smoke in the few seconds he'd been flying through it. When the last of the Imperial troops vanished in their retreat, the Immaculate One simply flew away. Claude entertained the random notion that it/he/she, dragons had genders, right, was trying to give chase, maybe stop the Imperials from retreating altogether? Even though he had absolutely no rational reasoning to back up that explanation. Then he gave his head a shake, and gently urged Ivory down to the ground. He could feel her shivering from exertion that the day had forced on her as she made her way down toward Byleth, Dimitri, and the others, who had spread out a bit to make room for her. Thanks, girl, he said softly, rubbing her neck. You were amazing today. Ivory responded with a tired chitter as she circled around the familiar faces below and slowly alit on the ground. I know. I promise, I'm going to spoil you silly tomorrow. You're going to be the happiest wyvern in Fodlan. He rubbed her neck again, slid his bow into her saddlebag and jumped off her back. His legs ached from the half-day? 3/4 of the day? His sense of time was completely muddled by the battle, and while the sun was setting now, he honestly couldn't remember where it had been when the siege had started. It wasn't until he tried to take a few steps away from her that he realized how badly his legs were shaking. They practically turned to water right underneath him. Strong, warm arms caught him before he could collapse and embarrass himself in front of everyone. Groaning, he looked up and met Byleth's exhausted but joyful emerald gold eyes. Seconds later she pulled him into a tight hug. We're all alive, she said, in weak wonder. We actually all made it out alive. We did it. We won. We won the battle, at least. Dimitri said, joining them. Claude tilted his head in her embrace and noted with worry that he was covered in dirt, bruises and blood stains. But he was smiling, if faintly, and those sapphire eyes glowed with relief when they settled on him. He did his best to smile back. It wasn't easy. When he was a bit steadier, he straightened up and looked around, and flinched when he really took in the battlefield. Corpses everywhere, the stench of burnt flesh assaulting his nose, the groans of the dying and the wounded as the combined army of their people walked back and forth, finding those they could save and those who needed to be gently eased into the arms of the goddess. Whatever that meant when she was hitching a ride in Byleth's body and couldn't remember anything after Agartha scorched Fodlan bare of life. There was a disturbing thought. Even though the Imperial soldiers had come to kill him and all his friends, seeing so many of them dead was awful. This is war. This is nothing anyone should ever want. Claude looked around his friends. Marianne had dismounted from her horse, blood staining her armor. Her eyes were shut and she was praying as she cried. Ash stood next to her, pale as a ghost and shaking even as he did his best to set his own pain aside to comfort her. Lawrence was leaning heavily on Leonie, who fussed over him as Flane worked to heal his injuries. Raphael had sat down on a rock, catching his breath and staring down at his bloody gauntlets like he'd never seen his hands before. Atra was speaking to Ingrid, one hand on an arrow buried in her side as Glenn gave the blonde a cloth to bite on in preparation to remove it. Felix was sitting on a rock, cradling an exhausted Bernadetta in his arms. Claude's heart skipped a beat before he noticed she was visibly breathing as she drifted off to sleep. Sylvain was trying to reassure an openly sobbing Dorothea with a hug, looking as lost as he'd ever seen the redhead. Ignatz was helping Shamir lift the dead body of a knight onto a stretcher for transport. Yuri was sitting and clutching his shoulder. Balthus, Hilda, and Happy were all hovering around him as Linhard went to work closing all his injuries. Annette was kneeling next to Mercedes, sweetly and sadly singing while holding someone's hand. He couldn't tell if the man was Church or Empire, but it didn't really matter, did it? Lysathea and Constance were wandering the field, watching Seath seek out wounded Imperials with Geralt's mercenaries having fanned out to do the same. We won. Why doesn't it feel like the incredible victory it technically is? Hilda. Balthus. A familiar older male voice cut across the bloody field, and managed to raise Claude's spirits just a bit. Hilda spun around, let out an incomprehensible shrieking noise, and ran off into the arms of Holst Goneril. He wouldn't say that the young lord was a friend, but he often found that he was an ally during the conferences. Holst had a warm, handsome face and was built like he'd walked straight out of a romance novel, windswept light red hair, pale skin marred only by distinguished battle scars, blue eyes that had a spark of humor beneath the noble dignity he projected as easily as breathing. He was a war master, decked out in killer knuckles in a personal axe designed to cleave through armor and heavy cavalry. It was absolutely no wonder he was drowning in suitors. Holst radiated relief and happiness as he wrapped his arms around his beloved little sister and caught sight of his best friend, reassured at long last that both of them were alive. Holst. You have no idea how good it is to see your face, Balthus laughed as he skidded to a halt a few feet away from his friend. Oh, I think I have some idea, Holst retorted in all seriousness, the words certainly understating the fear that would have been plaguing him ever since he got the ultimatum. I see you managed not to get mangled by the demonic beasts that were running all over the damned place, gives me hope. Ah, you're never going to let that die, are you? Balthus retorted, any petulance in his voice strained and clearly a performance. I was thinking you would miss this rumble, what with the travel time and all. Should really realize by now that my bets never roll out. Which is why you shouldn't bet at all, Holst bantered back with fond exasperation, ruffling Hilda's hair. Glad I convinced you to take the creepy axe with you after all. The teasing was a little weak, undercut by the sheer relief in his voice. Hilda let out a muffled laugh that sounded like it was suppressing tears. Smiling with set understanding, Holst looked up and swept his gaze over the lions and the deer. You kids look exhausted. Come with me, my men and I gonna make you a place to rest up while we handle the cleanup. You've done more than enough to deserve it. Huh? But I can still help, Byleth protested, despite the tangible exhaustion in her voice. Teach, Claude mumbled, tugging on her arm. Please, yield to logic. I am too tired, too confused and too stunned to trick you into taking care of yourself right now. She let out an adorable squeak of protest, which made the deer around them laugh. Felix picked up Bernadetta bridal style and carried her with very tender care as he walked over in Holst's direction, seeing the usually prickly teen accept the offer without so much as a snarky remark convinced the rest of them to follow in his wake. Rest sounded very good right now. Check the description for the links to the author.